Rome, the eternal city, a place of unmatched power, breathtaking beauty, and unimaginable cruelty. But in the summer of 64 AD, that eternal flame nearly burned out. For 6 long days and nights, fire raged through the heart of the empire, swallowing temples, markets, and homes. Ash choked the sky, screams echoed in the streets, and fear turned to suspicion. Who had lit the match? Some claimed it was fate. Others whispered of the gods' anger, but most pointed their fingers at one Nero, the emperor. A ruler who loved music more than war, who saw himself as a god among mortals, and who may have stood watching the flames with a lyre in his hands. Was Nero truly the monster who burned Rome, or has history painted him darker than he was? This is the twisted tale of ambition, betrayal, and fire. This is the story of Nero, the emperor who burnt Rome. Welcome to dark history. If you crave the untold, the sinister, and the forgotten truths of the past, make sure you subscribe and join us as we walk together into the shadows of history. Chapter 1. The Making of a Tyranny, the shadow of history's grand stage. Few names conjure the same chilling blend of fascination and dread as Nero. Claudius Caesar, Augustus, Germanicus, the man we simply know as Nero. For nearly 2,000 years, his name has echoed as a warning, a whisper of corruption, of cruelty, of a Rome set ablaze, both literally and metaphorically. He is remembered as the emperor who fiddled while Rome burned, the monstrous ruler who indulged in decadence while his people suffered. But to understand how such a figure emerged, how a boy became the tyrant who would one day stand accused of burning the eternal city itself, we must journey back to the very beginning. To a Rome already trembling with intrigue, ambition, and betrayal. This is the making of a tyrant. The bloodline of Shadows. Nero was not born to obscurity. He was born on December 15th, 37 AD, into a world dripping with power, privilege, and peril. His mother, Agrippina the Younger, was a woman both revered and feared, ruthless, ambitious, and utterly determined to carve out her son's path to the throne. Agrippina's bloodline alone made Nero dangerous. She was the great-granddaughter of Augustus, the first Roman emperor, and the sister of Caligula, one of the most infamous tyrants Rome had ever endured. From his very first breath, Nero's existence was tethered to destiny and darkness. His father Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus was said to be cruel, violent, and of questionable morality traits that would one day echo in his son's reign. But the father would not live long enough to shape Nero's future. When Nero was just 3 years old, his father died, leaving Agrippina to wield her formidable influence alone. In Rome, family was both shield and dagger. To be born into the Julio-Claudian dynasty was to walk among gods and monsters. Young Nero's blood made him an heir to power, but also a target in the endless game of Roman politics, where whispers could kill and ambition burned hotter than any flame. A childhood in the shadows. Agrippina's ambitions for Nero were boundless, but the path was treacherous. When Caligula, Agrippina's brother and Nero's uncle, ascended to the throne, she basked in her brother's power. Yet in the court of Caligula, affection was fleeting, and loyalty was a fragile mask. Agrippina quickly fell from favor, accused of conspiring against her own brother. She was exiled, forced into the shadows, and young Nero was stripped of the protection her influence had offered. Nero's early years were marked by instability and fear. In exile, Agrippina could do little for her son, and Nero lived at the mercy of relatives and shifting tides of political fortune. It was a world where a smile could conceal a dagger, and where survival meant learning to mask your thoughts, your fears, and your ambitions. But exile was not permanent. Caligula's reign, mad, erratic, and drenched in blood, came to a brutal end when he was assassinated in 41 AD. His death unleashed a storm in Rome. But for Agrippina, it was an opportunity. The throne passed not to Caligula's heir, but to Claudius, her uncle and now emperor. Slowly, carefully, Agrippina clawed her way back into power, aligning herself with the court and maneuvering her son into position. The rise of Agrippina was not a woman of hesitation. She was a strategist, a master manipulator in a world dominated by men. Through cunning, alliances, and whispers in the dark halls of power, she secured her return to Rome. By 49 AD, she had become the fourth wife of Emperor Claudius himself, cementing her place at the heart of imperial rule. And with this marriage, her son Nero was suddenly transformed from a precarious child of fated nobility into the adopted son of the Emperor of Rome. Agrippina's triumph was complete, but make no mistake, her ambition did not stop at security. She wanted the throne itself, not for her, but for her son. It was Agrippina who ensured Nero was educated by Rome's finest tutors. Chief among them was the philosopher Seneca, a man of immense intellect and moral conviction, tasked with shaping the young Nero into a ruler of wisdom and virtue. Under Seneca's guidance, Nero studied philosophy, rhetoric, poetry, and the arts. He was groomed to be not only an emperor, but a figure of culture, a man who could dazzle with words as well as power. Yet behind the careful lessons and cultivated image, there lingered something darker. Nero was not like other boys. He reveled in performance, in music, in theater. He adored applause and the intoxication of an audience. While others were trained in the arts of war, Nero dreamed of stages, of singing before thousands, of basking in the love of the crowd. For Agrippina, this was both a gift and a weakness. She needed her son to rule, not to play. But ambition is a fire that consumes, and Nero's hunger for adoration would one day ignite into something far more dangerous. The fall of Britannicus. Agrippina's path to securing Nero's throne was not without obstacles. The greatest threat lay in Britannicus, the biological son of Claudius and rightful heir. To secure Nero's future, Agrippina had to eliminate Britannicus, not physically, then politically. Through manipulation and persuasion, she convinced Claudius to adopt Nero as his own son. In 50 AD, the adoption was formalized, and Nero became heir, alongside Britannicus, but Agrippina's influence ensured that Nero was elevated above him in succession. Nero was only 16 years old when he was married to Octavia, Claudius's daughter, binding him even tighter to the imperial family. The pieces were falling into place. Agrippina's ambition had nearly achieved its ultimate goal, but in 54 AD, the final step was taken. Claudius, the emperor, died suddenly. Ancient sources whisper of poison, of a dish of mushrooms laced with death, prepared by Agrippina herself. Whether murder or misfortune, the result was the same. The throne of Rome was empty, and in its place, a boy of 16 ascended, the boy who would one day be remembered as the tyrant who burned Rome. The young Emperor Nero. His succession was heralded with celebration. Rome welcomed its new emperor with cautious optimism. He was young, charming, and seemingly malleable, with Agrippina at his side, Seneca as his advisor, and Burrus, the head of the Praetorian Guard, as protector. Nero appeared to be surrounded by wisdom and strength. At first, his reign seemed almost promising. In those early years, Rome saw policies of clemency, moderation, and fairness. Seneca and Burrus guided the young emperor carefully, curbing his impulses and shaping his image as a benevolent ruler. He lowered taxes, pardoned political prisoners, and appeared generous to the people. But beneath the polished surface, cracks were forming. Agrippina, having achieved her dream, expected to rule through her son. Yet Nero, intoxicated by his newfound power and independence, bristled under her control. The bond between mother and son, once so tight, began to fracture. And in that fracture, the first seeds of darkness began to sprout. The echoes of destiny, the story of Nero, is not simply one of cruelty. It is a story of a boy thrust into unimaginable power, shaped by a mother's ruthless ambition, tutored by philosophers, yet consumed by his own insatiable hunger for adoration and indulgence. As we leave this first chapter, Nero is no longer the child of uncertainty, no longer the pawn in Agrippina's grand design. He is the Emperor of Rome, seated upon a throne built by blood, betrayal, and ambition. The eternal city waits, watching its young ruler. Some see hope, others dread, but none could foresee the inferno to come. For in Nero, Rome had birthed not a savior, but a tyrant in the making. Chapter 2. A puppet on the throne. The throne of Rome was not simply a seat of power. It was a gilded cage, a furnace where ambition, corruption, and betrayal burned endlessly. When Nero Claudius Caesar ascended in 54 AD, at the tender age of 16, he was no more than a boy king surrounded by wolves. His every decision was scrutinized, his every weakness exploited. Though Rome hailed him as emperor, in truth, Nero's reign began not with authority, but with manipulation. He was the face of the empire, but behind that face stood those who pulled the strings. The triumvirate of control, the real rulers of Rome in those first years were three figures: Agrippina, Nero's mother; Seneca, his philosopher tutor; and Burrus, the commander of the Praetorian Guard. Together, they formed a triumvirate that guided the young emperor's every move. Agrippina was the iron hand, convinced that she had secured the throne, not just for her son, but for herself. She sat behind Nero at public events, received foreign ambassadors at her side, and even issued imperial orders in her own name. She imagined herself a co-ruler, an empress in all but title. Seneca, wise and eloquent, saw in Nero a chance to put philosophy into practice. He believed that if the young emperor could be molded, Rome might enjoy a reign of justice and mercy. He drafted Nero's speeches, encouraged acts of clemency, and softened the emperor's rough edges. Burrus, a soldier of discipline and loyalty, ensured that the Praetorian Guard supported Nero's rule. Without the guard, emperors could fall overnight. With Burrus's backing, Nero's position was secure at least for now. The young emperor was more symbol than sovereign. Rome's senators and citizens looked to him, but in reality, it was Agrippina's ambition, Seneca's pen, and Burrus's sword that steered the empire. The promise of a golden age, surprisingly, those early years, under Nero's reign seemed almost like a golden dawn. With Seneca and Burrus guiding him, policies leaned toward mercy and generosity. Nero reduced harsh taxes, banned secret trials, and even promised to respect the Senate's authority, a gesture that won him the favor of Rome's elite. He was praised as a new Augustus, a bringer of peace after the paranoia of Claudius and the madness of Caligula. Public games were hosted, grain was distributed, and the empire seemed to breathe more freely. The people loved him for his youth and charm. Nero would appear in public, dressed not as a stern ruler, but as a man of the people. He smiled, he spoke gently, he even dabbled in poetry and music, sharing his performances in private gatherings. For Rome, weary of tyrants, this gentleness felt refreshing. But beneath the surface, the seeds of disaster were already sprouting. Nero did not crave the responsibilities of empire. He craved applause, attention, and freedom. While Seneca urged him toward philosophy and governance, Nero dreamed of stages, of acting and singing before adoring crowds. Rome believed it had a philosopher king. What it truly had was an actor waiting for his spotlight. Agrippina's grip. The greatest tension of these early years lay between Nero and his mother. Agrippina's ambitions were boundless, and she could not let go of the throne she had fought to secure. At first, Nero tolerated her dominance. She attended Senate meetings, rode in the same carriage as her son, and demanded recognition as the power behind the emperor. But as Nero grew older, the weight of her presence suffocated him. Conflict erupted when Nero began to assert his independence. he found comfort in the arms of Octa, a former slave girl, whose simplicity and affection contrasted with his mother's cold, manipulative grasp. Agrippina was outraged. How dare her son, the emperor, defy her with a low-born mistress, she demanded. He abandoned Octa, but Nero resisted. Worse still, Agrippina sought to remind her son that he was not invincible. She openly threatened to champion Britannicus, the biological son of Claudius, as the rightful heir. Nero's throne, she reminded him, existed only because of her. This was a dangerous game. Britannicus, though younger than Nero, was legitimate, and his claim could rally opposition. Agrippina's threat planted fear deep within Nero's mind, and fear, in Rome, often led to blood. The death of Britannicus in 55 AD. Britannicus fell suddenly and violently ill during a banquet. Guests described the boy gasping for breath, his skin turning pale, his life slipping away before horrified eyes. Though physicians blamed epilepsy, whispers quickly spread. Britannicus had been poisoned. Many pointed to Nero, others pointed to Agrippina, but either way, the result was clear. Britannicus was dead, and Nero's position as sole heir was secure. For the young emperor, this was a turning point. The innocence of youth began to peel away. He had learned the harsh truth of Roman power's survival demanded ruthlessness. Whether by his own hand or his mother's, Britannicus's death marked the first true blood spilled in Nero's reign. Agrippina, however, celebrated too openly. She boasted of her control, reminding Nero that she had orchestrated everything. For a son already suffocating under her shadow, this arrogance was intolerable. Nero began to hate the woman who had given him the throne. Breaking the chains, the struggle between Nero and Agrippina soon escalated into open hostility. Agrippina, sensing her influence waning, grew desperate. She meddled in his marriage to Octavia, demanded greater recognition, and sought to interfere in his private affairs. But Nero had tasted power and he would not surrender it back to her. He surrounded himself with new advisors, men of indulgence rather than virtue. Chief among them was Otho, a charming aristocrat who encouraged Nero's excesses. With such company, Nero drifted further from Seneca's guidance and deeper into a world of pleasure and decadence. Agrippina, furious at her son's defiance, played her final card. She threatened to side with the army and elevate another man to the throne. For Nero, this was no longer a battle of influence. It was a battle for survival. The fall of Agrippina by 59 AD, Nero made his decision. His mother, the very woman who had secured his empire, would have to die. The story of Agrippina's murder is one of the most infamous in Roman history. Nero invited her to a banquet on the coast, where he planned her assassination. His first attempt involved a collapsing boat, designed to sink at sea and make her death appear accidental. But Agrippina, ever resilient, swam to shore and survived. Humiliated, Nero turned to direct violence. He sent assassins to her villa, where they cornered her in her chamber. Ancient sources record her final words: "Strike me here, in my womb, for it bore such a monster." With that, Agrippina was slain by her own son's command. The act shocked Rome. To murder one's mother was unthinkable, a crime against nature itself. But Nero showed little remorse. With Agrippina gone, he was finally free of her grip. Free but also unbound, unanchored, and unrestrained. The puppet had cut his strings. The emperor emerges with Agrippina's death. Nero no longer needed to pretend. He began to indulge in the life he truly craved: lavish banquets, endless theater, music, and performance. He abandoned the careful restraint of Seneca and Burrus, replacing philosophy with pleasure. Yet Rome was not prepared for an emperor who longed to be an actor. In Roman culture, theater was considered lowly, a profession for slaves and commoners. For the emperor himself to perform on stage was scandalous, humiliating, even dangerous. But Nero did not care. He wanted adoration, and he would take it wherever he could find it. This desire for performance would one day define his reign and doom it. The shadow of things to come in the early years, Nero was still adored by many. He was young, handsome, generous with games and gifts, but beneath the celebrations, darkness gathered. His paranoia grew, his indulgences deepened, and his reliance on corrupt companions pulled him further from virtue. Rome had welcomed him as a symbol of renewal, a promise of peace after chaos. But now, the cracks were clear. The boy king had murdered his brother, his mother, and silenced his critics. His hunger for attention was insatiable, and his fear of betrayal was unquenchable. The puppet had become master of his own stage, but, in doing so, he had begun the descent into tyranny, and soon, the world would discover just how destructive Nero's performance could be. Chapter 3. The Actor Emperor. When Agrippina's body was carried away, Rome thought it had witnessed the climax of Nero's cruelty, but in truth, it was only the prologue. The death of his mother freed Nero from restraint, but it also unmoored him from the guiding hands that had tried to anchor him. Burrus, though loyal, was a soldier who tolerated Nero's excesses so long as the Praetorian Guard was secure. Seneca still attempted to whisper philosophy into the emperor's ear, but his words were now drowned beneath the clamor of musicians, actors, and flatterers who fed Nero's hunger for admiration. The boy who once needed his mother's shadow to stand had now stepped into the light, but instead of the forum or senate, he chose the stage. The birth of a performer. Nero's fascination with performance had begun in childhood. Tutors had taught him music and poetry, and he had eagerly taken to the lyre. But what began as an education became an obsession. He did not see art as pastime, but as destiny. To him, power was not measured in military victories or senatorial decrees, but in applause. Now, emperor, he had access to the greatest audiences in the world. At first, he performed only in private gatherings, strumming his lyre and reciting verses while friends applauded. But soon the walls of the palace felt too small. He longed for the roar of the crowd, the ovations of the people. When Nero announced that he would sing publicly, Rome gasped. To Romans, the theater was a place for entertainers, not rulers. Senators sneered, nobles whispered, and the common people laughed. The emperor, they said, debased himself by seeking the approval of the mob. But Nero was unmoved. He declared, "What use is my voice if it is never heard?" The first performances, the stage was set in lavish fashion. Nero appeared not as emperor, but as artist, draped in flowing robes, his hair styled in curls, a golden lyre in his hand. He recited poetry with theatrical flourish, sang songs of love and tragedy, and commanded musicians to accompany his verses. To his delight, the people clapped. Some clapped out of fear, some out of flattery, some because they genuinely enjoyed the spectacle. But to Nero, every sound of hands striking together was proof of his genius. He demanded that the doors of the theater be locked during his performances so no one could leave. Senators endured hours of recitation, sweating under the heat, desperate for relief, yet forced to applaud at the end. One man feigned death just to be carried out. Another leaped over the walls to escape. Stories spread like wildfire, half comedy, half horror, but they always ended with the same truth. Nero's obsession with performance was unstoppable. Rome's uneasy laughter. The city of Rome had never seen an emperor like this. Augustus had crafted an empire. Tiberius had ruled with suspicion. Caligula had shocked with cruelty, and Claudius had governed with pedantic care. But Nero wanted to be loved not as emperor, but as performer. The people joked about it in taverns. Some compared him to a child dressing in costumes, others to a god who descended into clownery. But none dared laugh openly. The guard watched, and the emperor's spies lurked in every crowd. Yet there was a darker undercurrent. Nero's desire for applause was no mere vanity, was a hunger. Those who denied him could not be tolerated. Those who mocked him faced exile, imprisonment, or worse. The emperor's art demanded not only attention, but obedience. Seneca, once Nero's guiding hand, now watched helplessly. He had hoped to shape a philosopher king, a ruler who embodied stoic virtue. Instead, he saw a boy lost in his own illusions. In letters and speeches, Seneca tried to temper Nero's excesses. He urged moderation, warned of the dangers of vanity, and begged him to balance art with duty. But Nero had grown weary of restraint. "Philosophy," he sneered one evening, "cannot teach me how to play the lyre." Seneca withdrew further from court, his influence waning. Burrus, too, began to lose sway, his health declining, as Nero surrounded himself with flatterers and sick. Without these two anchors, Nero was adrift free to indulge every whim without resistance. The golden palace of dreams. As his performances grew, so too did Nero's taste for spectacle. He envisioned Rome not as the capital of an empire, but as a stage for his artistic genius. He ordered vast renovations of theaters, commissioned new arenas, and poured imperial wealth into entertainment. He spoke often of building a palace, unlike any seen before, palace not for an emperor, but for a good artist, golden halls, mirrored chambers, gardens, with fountains that sprayed perfume into the air. This dream would later become reality in the form of the Doma Soria, the Golden House. For now, it existed only in his imagination. But already Nero treated the empire as his canvas. Provinces were taxed not for war or governance, but for art and luxury. Senators grumbled, soldiers muttered, but the people, those who filled the theaters, remained his adoring audience. Love and scandal in the midst of this theatrical reign. Nero's personal life added fuel to the fire. His marriage to Octavia, daughter of Claudius, was cold and loveless. She was noble, virtuous, and silent, everything Nero despised. He sought passion elsewhere, first in Octa, then in more scandalous affairs. Soon he became infatuated with Poppaea Sabina, a woman of dazzling beauty and ruthless ambition. Poppaea knew how to charm him, how to flatter his vanity, how to whisper in his ear that he deserved greatness. But she also despised Octavia, and through careful manipulation, she drove Nero further from his wife. Agrippina had once been the dominant woman in his life. Now Poppaea claimed that throne not as mother, but as lover. She urged him toward indulgence, toward grandeur, toward absolute freedom from restraint. Octavia was sidelined, her dignity mocked, her place at court diminished. The people sympathized with her, for she was blameless, but their whispers did little to protect her. Nero's heart now belonged to Poppaea, and he would sacrifice anything to keep her. Blood in the shadows. With Agrippina gone, opposition grew bolder. Senators murmured, generals grumbled, and some even plotted rebellion. Nero, paranoid of betrayal, struck first. Trials were staged, accusations of treason fabricated, and noble blood spilled on imperial command. But unlike previous emperors who killed for power, Nero killed for security, like a man silencing critics in the audience. Every whisper of dissent was a heckle to be crushed, every rival applause stolen from him. Rome had entered an age of fear. Outwardly, the city laughed and applauded. Inwardly, it trembled, the emperor's voice yet to Nero. All of this was secondary. His heart was on the stage. He dreamed of surpassing the poets of Greece, of outshining the actors of old. He performed tragedies, sang epics, and even competed in contests, though no contest was truly fair, for who dared defeat the emperor? When he sang, he demanded silence, and silence he received. When he finished, he demanded applause, and applause thundered, whether sincere or not. For Nero, this was proof not of fear, but of love. He believed himself adored, a god of art as well as empire. In this illusion, he found purpose. In this applause, he found meaning. And in this obsession, he planted the seeds of Rome's greatest fire, foreshadowing the flames by the end of his first decade in power. Nero had transformed the empire. No longer was Rome ruled by discipline or philosophy. It was ruled by performance, by vanity, by spectacle. The emperor was not a general, nor a statesman, nor even a tyrant in the traditional sense. He was an actor with the world as his stage. But behind the laughter and applause, resentment grew. The Senate despised him, the generals distrusted him, and the common people, though entertained, began to whisper of extravagance and waste. The empire was a tinderbox, dry and brittle, and Nero, strumming his golden lyre, was the spark. Chapter 4: Shadows of Betrayal. The death of Agrippina had torn away the last tether holding Nero to restraint. Now the empire belonged to his impulses, his whims, and above all, his stage. Yet beneath the shimmering surface of lyres, theaters, and ovations, a darker reality began to stir. The empire whispered of treason, the Senate muttered of disgrace, and the legions abroad began to look upon their emperor with suspicion. Rome was a city divided, half enthralled by Nero the artist, half horrified by Nero the emperor, and in that division, betrayal thrived. The waning of the wizen, the early years of Nero's reign. Two men had guided him: Burrus, commander of the Praetorian Guard, and Seneca, the Stoic philosopher who had been his tutor. Together, they had softened his excesses, restrained his temper, and steered his policies toward stability. But with Agrippina gone, their influence began to wither. Burrus, though loyal, was a soldier of discipline. He tolerated Nero's performances, but he bristled at the emperor's growing disregard for the Senate and his wasteful spending on artistic projects. His health began to fail, and in AD 62, Burrus died, whether from illness or poison, none could say. Some whispered that Nero had hastened his end. Others believed it was natural. Whatever the truth, the result was the same. The Guard no longer had a commander strong enough to counterbalance Nero's excesses. Seneca, too, felt his influence slipping. He had once believed he could mold Nero into a philosopher king, but the boy he had tutored now mocked philosophy as dull and irrelevant compared to the thrill of performance. Seneca begged leave to retire from court, claiming age and frailty, but Nero would not allow it. Instead, the emperor kept him close, half out of respect, half out of suspicion. The circle around Nero was no longer composed of statesmen, but of flatterers, artists, and opportunists who knew how to feed his vanity. Men of substance were sidelined. Men of performance prospered. The rise of Poppaea, the center of Nero's personal life, now stood Poppaea Sabina. She was not merely beautiful, though. Beauty she had in abundance, with golden hair and a gaze that could cut as sharp as any blade. She was cunning, ambitious, and knew exactly how to manipulate the emperor's desires. Where Agrippina had commanded Nero with fear, Poppaea ruled him with seduction. She whispered that he was not only an emperor, but a god destined for immortality through art. She encouraged his performances, his extravagances, his dreams of a golden palace, and above all, she urged him to cast aside Octavia, the silent, virtuous wife who had done nothing wrong except bore Nero with her dignity. The Roman people adored Octavia. She was the daughter of Claudius, the image of purity, and a victim of Nero's neglect. To touch her was to risk public anger, but Poppaea wanted her gone. When Burrus still lived, he had restrained Nero from divorcing Octavia, but with Burrus dead, Poppaea pressed her advantage. Nero accused Octavia of infertility, of coldness, of failing in her duty as empress. The Senate, cowed by fear, allowed the divorce. Soon after, Octavia was exiled, sent away from Rome in disgrace. The people rioted, filling the streets with cries of her name, demanding her return. Alarmed, Nero recalled her briefly, but Poppaea would not be denied. False charges of adultery were fabricated. Octavia was seized, bound, and executed. Her head was delivered to Poppaea As proof, Rome wept. But Nero sang, "The blood of nobles." Death was only the beginning. Nero, growing ever more paranoid, began to see conspirators everywhere. Senators who hesitated in applause, generals who delayed in correspondence, even poets who failed to praise his performances became suspect. Trials were staged in which accusations of treason were leveled without evidence. Noblemen were forced to defend themselves against impossible charges, and more often than not, they were condemned. Wealthy estates were confiscated, fortunes poured into Nero's spectacles. While blood filled the Tiber with increasing regularity, some chose suicide over execution, following the Stoic ideal that death with dignity was better than life in humiliation. These deaths horrified Rome, but they also added to Nero's sense of grandeur. He fancied himself not merely emperor, but judge of life and death, artist of destinies. Seneca watched in despair. Though untouched at first, he knew his turn would come. The philosopher had taught Nero to govern with reason, but now he could only watch as reason drowned beneath the tide of vanity and paranoia. The empire at the edge while Nero's Rome descended into spectacle and blood. The provinces strained. The empire stretched from the deserts of Africa to the forests of Germania, from the sands of Syria to the cold shores of Britannia. Such an expanse required discipline, strong generals, and careful governance. But Nero had little interest in provinces beyond the taxes they provided for his performances. In Britain, rebellion stirred under the leadership of Boudica, queen of the Iceni. In Judea, unrest simmered as Roman governors abused their power. In Armenia, tensions with Parthia threatened to boil into war. Nero left these matters largely to his generals, caring little as long as Rome's coffers remained full. Victories were celebrated as his own, defeats ignored. He appeared before the Senate not to discuss strategy, but to recite poetry. The empire, like Rome itself, had become a theater, and Nero, the eternal actor, demanded applause. Rome's fear and fascination spite the bloodshed. Despite the waste, Nero still retained a strange hold over the people. They despised his cruelty, mocked his vanity, but they adored his performances. He gave them games, festivals, music, and spectacle unlike anything Rome had seen. The poor were fed, the mob entertained, and for many, that was enough. Rome's laughter, though uneasy, often drowned out its fear. Yet those who lived in the shadows of power knew the truth. The emperor was unpredictable, dangerous, and his paranoia grew with each passing year. Rome had seen cruel rulers before, but never one who combined cruelty with performance. Vanity with blood. The stage was set for something far greater and far darker than anything yet seen. Foreshadow of fire by the close of AD 64. Rome was tense. The Senate seethed in silence, the provinces murmured with unrest, and whispers of conspiracy threaded through every noble house. Nero, oblivious or unwilling to care, pressed forward with his dream, to build a palace of unimaginable luxury, a monument to his genius. But to clear the ground for such a palace, something had to give. Rome, crowded with wooden structures, narrow streets, and crumbling tenements, was a city ripe for disaster. All it would take was one spark, and when the flames came, the people would remember Nero, not for his songs, but for the fire that devoured their city. Chapter 5. Flames of a City. The summer of AD 64 was blistering in Rome. The narrow streets baked beneath the relentless sun, and the crowded tenements, built of dry timber, leaned against one another like tinder stacked for a pyre. The city was restless, filled with the cries of merchants, the chanting of beggars, the brawling of taverns. Yet beneath it all lay a tension that no one could quite explain, as if the air itself carried an omen. That omen came on the night of July 18th. The first spark the fire began in the Circus Maximus, Rome's great arena for chariot racing, a place already infamous for its wooden stalls and flammable storage rooms. No one knew the cause. Some claimed it was an accident, perhaps a spark from a kitchen fire or a lamp overturned. Others swore it was deliberate, the work of arsonists carrying torches in the night. What mattered was not how it started, but how it spread. Within moments, flames leaped from stall to stall, racing up the dry timbers, climbing across balconies. The circus became an inferno, and the fire rushed outward, devouring the nearby shops and homes. The wind, cruel and hot, fanned the flames. Sparks drifted like fiery snow, landing on rooftops across the city. Soon entire districts erupted, flames racing down narrow streets, trapping families in their homes. Screams filled the night, and the darkness of Rome was replaced by a glow brighter than the moon. Panic and chaos. Rome had burned before. Fires were common in a city built of wood and straw, but never had the flames spread with such ferocity. People fled with what little they could carry: children, household gods, jars of grain. Streets clogged with panicked mobs, trampling one another in desperation. Some sought safety at the river, throwing themselves into the Tiber to escape the smoke. Others rushed to the open fields outside the city, watching as the skyline of Rome vanished in flame. The heat was unbearable. Roof tiles cracked and shattered, walls collapsed, and molten lead from aqueduct pipes ran through the streets like rivers of silver death. Those who did not burn choked on smoke. The city's fire brigades tried to fight the inferno, but the scale was too vast. Buckets of water were meaningless against a sea of fire. Worse still, rumors spread of men blocking the efforts. They were acting under orders, preventing citizens from saving their homes. Some swore they saw torches thrown deliberately into houses that might have been spared, whose orders no one dared say aloud, but the whisper passed from lip to lip. Nero. Where was the emperor? At the time the fire began, Nero was not in Rome. He had retreated to his villa at Antium by the sea, seeking respite from the heat and the endless intrigues of the city. Word reached him of the disaster, and he hurried back. When he arrived, Rome was unrecognizable. The flames had devoured entire districts: the Aventine, the Celian, the Palatine. Temples that had stood for centuries collapsed in ash. Statues of the gods melted into shapeless bronze. The cries of the wounded and homeless echoed across the smoking ruins. And above it all, the flames still roared. Unstoppable it was here, in the midst of the inferno, that the story would be born, the tale that would haunt Nero forever. The song of the burning city. Some said that, as Rome burned, Nero climbed to the tower of Maecenas and gazed upon the flames. With the city collapsing beneath him, he took up his lyre and sang of the fall of Troy, comparing Rome's destruction to the ancient city consumed by fire. Did he truly sing as Rome burned? The historians disagree. Tacitus, cautious, admits only that such rumors were spread. Suetonius and Cassius Dio, less forgiving, declare it as fact. Whether true or not, the image took hold in the minds of the people. Their emperor, not weeping for their loss, but delighting in the spectacle, treating their suffering as a performance. The phrase would echo through history: Nero fiddled while Rome burned. The aftermath: when at last the flames subsided, 7 days later, Rome was a corpse of itself. 10 of its 14 districts had been reduced to rubble. Thousands were dead, tens of thousands homeless. Temples, homes, markets gone. The people wandered the ruins in shock, clutching what little remained of their lives. Nero moved quickly to rebuild his image. He opened the Campus Martis and his own gardens to the homeless, providing shelter. He organized relief, bringing grain and supplies to the survivors. He declared that Rome would rise again, stronger and more beautiful than before. But even in his generosity, suspicion lingered. Too many remembered the men who had stopped them from saving their homes. Too many whispered of Nero's dream of a new palace, one that would require vast land cleared of the city's old streets, And soon, those whispers became open accusations. Nero had set the fire himself. A scapegoat Nero needed. Someone to blame to deflect suspicion from himself. He turned to a small, despised sect that had begun to spread through Rome. The Christians. They were already unpopular, strange in their customs, refusing to worship Rome's gods, rumored to practice dark rites in secret. They made an easy target. Nero declared them guilty of the fire, branding them enemies of the people. The persecution that followed was among the most brutal in Roman history. Christians were arrested, tortured, and executed in grotesque spectacles. Some were covered in pitch and set alight to serve as human torches in Nero's gardens. Others were sewn into the skins of wild beasts and torn apart by dogs. Still others were crucified, left to die in agony beneath the Roman sun. Rome watched in horror, yet some cheered, believing justice had been done. But in the shadows, even the cruelest citizens muttered uneasily. They sensed that these punishments were less about justice and more about Nero's desperate attempt to cleanse his own guilt. The birth of a golden dream, with the ruins of Rome cleared, Nero's dream began to take form. He commissioned the construction of the Doma Saratha, Golden House. It was no mere palace. It was a city within a city, sprawling across the heart of Rome, built where homes and temples had once stood. Walls glittered with gold leaf and precious stones. Ceilings were painted with mythological scenes. Rooms rotated with the sun, designed with engineering marvels. At its center stood a colossal statue of Nero himself, taller than any monument Rome had ever seen. To Nero, it was the fulfillment of destiny, a palace worthy of a god, a stage upon which he could live out his role as the greatest performer in history. To the people, it was proof of their darkest fears. Their city had burned, and their emperor had built himself a palace upon its ashes. The legacy of the flames, the Great Fire of Rome, was more than a disaster. It was a turning point. Nero's reputation, once balanced between extravagance and generosity, tipped irrevocably toward tyranny. The Senate, already weary of his vanity, now viewed him with open suspicion. The people, though still entertained by his games, carried the memory of their burned homes, and the Christians, brutalized in his name, carried stories that would echo through centuries. Nero had sought to be remembered as an artist, a god among men, but the fire had painted him in darker colors: arsonist, persecutor, destroyer of his own city. The flames had scarred Rome forever, and Nero's shadow, cast against the burning city, would never fade. Chapter 6. The Golden Palace. The ashes of the Great Fire of Rome still smoldered when Nero's grandest dream took shape. Where most emperors would have spoken of restoring the city's temples, markets, and forums, Nero envisioned something far greater, something that would forever mark him as more than a mere ruler. He would build a palace unlike any the world had ever seen, the Domus Aurea, the Golden House. A vision amidst the ruins of Rome stretched across the hills, like a wound. Families huddled in temporary shelters, living in makeshift camps. The stench of smoke, charred timber, and human despair still hung in the air. To Nero, however, the devastation was not a tragedy, it was an opportunity he had long dreamed of, a palace that would eclipse all others. His old residence, the Domus Transitoria, had burned in the flames. Now, with vast swaths of the city reduced to rubble, the chance had arrived to rebuild not a home, but an empire within an empire. When his architects, Severus and Celer, asked him what vision he desired, Nero's reply was chilling in its simplicity. Finally, I can live like a human being. But Nero's definition of human was far from ordinary. The scale of the dream, the Domus Aurea, was no mere palace. It was a vast complex, stretching from the Palatine Hill to the Esquiline Hill, swallowing entire neighborhoods in its embrace. Its grounds covered more than 300 acres, an expanse larger than some entire Roman cities. At the heart of the palace was an artificial lake, vast and glittering, around which gardens spread like a paradise. Groves of trees, meadows for grazing animals, and even vineyards filled the estate. Exotic beasts from Africa and the East roamed freely: giraffes, lions, leopards, and elephants. Reminders of Rome's conquests turned into Nero's playthings. The palace itself glittered with unimaginable splendor. Walls were coated with gold leaf and encrusted with pearls and gems. Ceilings were painted with elaborate frescoes of gods, myths, and heavens, some so lifelike they seemed to breathe. Rooms were designed to awe, with domes that sparkled like the stars. Most extraordinary of all was a dining hall whose ceiling could rotate with the movement of the heavens, showering guests with perfumes and rose petals as they feasted. This engineering marvel astonished even Rome's most cynical senators. And above it all, towering over the entire city, was the Colossus of Nero, a bronze statue over 100 feet tall, depicting the emperor as the sun god. Rome itself had become Nero's stage, and the Domus Aurea, his theater. The emperor, as a god. The construction of the Golden House was more than vanity. It was a statement. Nero had long believed himself destined not just to rule, but to transcend humanity. He saw himself as an artist, a performer, a god walking among mortals. The Domus Aurea was his shrine, built not to honor Jupiter or Mars, but to glorify Nero himself. When foreign ambassadors were brought to the palace, they stood in awe, overwhelmed by its splendor. The emperor guided them personally, speaking of how Rome had never known such beauty, and yet, beneath their forced smiles, many saw only arrogance. Where temples had once stood, Nero had planted gardens. Where homes had once sheltered families, Nero had built golden halls. The people murmured. Rome had burned so that Nero could build his dream. The people's anger, the common citizens of Rome, had not forgotten the fire. Many still lived in temporary shelters, their homes and shops gone forever. They saw Nero's palace rise where their neighborhoods had once stood, and bitterness grew. The emperor tried to placate them. He funded grain supplies, held lavish games, and hosted spectacles in the circus. He spoke of how the new Rome would be safer, rebuilt with wider streets, stone houses, and fireproof materials. He claimed the city's suffering was the price of rebirth, but to the people, these words rang hollow. They saw the golden house shimmering above them like a mocking jewel, proof that their emperor had traded their lives for his luxury. The hatred was quiet at first, spoken only in whispers, but it would grow louder, spreading from the streets to the Senate itself. The Senate's disdain for the senators of Rome. The Domus Aurea was an insult carved in stone. Traditionally, emperors had built monuments for the people, temples, forums, theaters. Even Caligula, mad as he was, had not dared to construct something so openly but Nero flaunted his creation with pride, as if daring the Senate to object. Senators who visited the palace were both astonished and outraged. They marveled at its artistry, yet they whispered venomously of Nero's excess. Behind closed doors, they asked one another, was this the ruler Rome deserved? Or was this the tyrant they had feared? Tacitus would later write that Nero had robbed the public of their city, leaving them only the illusion of freedom while keeping the heart of Rome for himself. The palace, he claimed, was less a residence than a monstrous symbol of one man's vanity, a stage for Nero's performance for Nero. However, the Golden House was more than a palace, it was a theater. He invited poets, singers, and actors to perform within its glittering halls. He hosted feasts that lasted days, with endless wine, music, and dance. But above all, he performed himself, clad in robes of shimmering silk, crowned with laurels. Nero sang and played the lyre to captivated audiences, or at least, audiences that pretended to be captivated. For no one dared to leave, no one dared to yawn, no one dared to show displeasure. Those who praised him were rewarded. Those who did not disappeared. Nero had transformed Rome's nobility into unwilling spectators in a performance that never ended. Rumors and shadows, even as the Domus Aurea rose, so too did the rumors of Nero's guilt in the Great Fire. The Christians still smoldered beneath the weight of his persecution, their executions etched into the memory of the people, but many began to see them not as arsonists, but as scapegoats. The whispers returned. Nero had burned Rome to clear space for his palace. Every glittering wall of the Golden House became, in the eyes of the people, a monument to his crime, and as resentment grew, so too did plots against him. Senators conspired in shadows, soldiers muttered in their camps. Even those closest to Nero began to wonder how long his reign could last. The Golden House, intended to immortalize him, had instead become the symbol of his tyranny, the price of grandeur for all its splendor. The Domus Aurea would not last. After Nero's death, later emperors would strip it of its treasures, bury its halls beneath new construction, and erase his memory from monuments. Yet, for a brief, dazzling moment, it had stood as the most extraordinary palace the world had ever seen. It was a testament not just to Nero's ambition, but to his madness. The Golden House revealed the heart of the emperor, brilliant, creative, theatrical, but also selfish, arrogant, and blind to the suffering of others. As Rome glittered in gold, the foundations of Nero's reign began to crack. The empire had tolerated his games, his vanity, even his extravagance. But when their homes burned and their labor built his palace, the people of Rome began to turn against him. And once the people's faith was gone, the Senate's patience would not last much longer. A shadow over Rome at night, when torches illuminated the Colossus of Nero, towering above the city. Citizens shivered in fear and anger. To some, he appeared not as a god, but as a monster who had devoured Rome to feed his dream. The Golden House, intended as a paradise, had become a curse. For while its walls gleamed with gold, the shadows it cast grew longer, stretching into the hearts of those who plotted Nero's downfall. The emperor could not see it yet. He feasted, sang, and reveled in his artificial paradise. But beyond its gates, the storm gathered, the storm that would one day consume him, just as fire had consumed Rome. Chapter 7: The Emperor and the Flames of Vanity. The year was 64 AD, and Rome had never seemed more invincible. The empire stretched across continents, its legions unchallenged, its coffers heavy with the spoils of conquest. Yet beneath the marble arches and gilded palaces, beneath the laughter of nobles and the chatter of merchants, there lingered whispers of unease. Rome's heart beat with both triumph and corruption, and nowhere did this contradiction find clearer embodiment than in its Emperor Nero, Claudius Caesar. Augustus Germanicus Nero was no ordinary ruler. He was not simply a commander of armies or a manager of senates. He fancied himself an artist, a poet, a musician chosen by the gods to illuminate the world with his genius. To Nero, ruling Rome was only part of his destiny. The other part, perhaps the greater part, was to immortalize his name in art, song, and performance. And yet, as history would cruelly remind us, vanity wrapped in absolute power could set not only a man aflame, but an entire empire. By the time the midsummer heat of July blanketed the city, Nero had grown restless. The city, sprawling and chaotic, with its haphazard wooden insulae, narrow streets, and overcrowded markets, offended his artistic sensibilities. To him, Rome was a masterpiece, ruined by careless brushstrokes. What was needed, Nero mused, was a new Rome, a city remade in his vision marble, where there was timber, grand boulevards, where there were alleys, harmony, where there was disorder. But to create such a masterpiece, the old canvas had to be burned away. Some claim that the fire that would soon consume Rome began in the Circus Maximus, sparked accidentally by merchants' wares, or by an unattended flame in one of the wooden stalls that pressed too close together. Others, more sinister in their accusations, whispered that the emperor himself had orchestrated it. Whether by chance or design, the inferno began on the night of July 18th, and within hours, Rome was choking on smoke and fear. Flames leaped like predators from one insula to another, devouring rooftops, licking across beams, snapping wooden structures like kindling. Winds carried sparks through the narrow streets, where panicked crowds trampled one another in their desperate flight. Mothers clutched children, old men collapsed in the smoke. Animals, driven mad by terror, added to the chaos. The night sky glowed a furious red, and the Tiber reflected the blaze like molten fire as the city burned. Nero retreated to his palace on the Palatine Hill. Whether he truly stood there, lyre in hand, reciting verses of Troy's destruction while watching his own city burn, remains uncertain. The image, immortalized by later chroniclers, has become one of the defining symbols of his reign. Nero, the artist-tyrant, serenading the apocalypse. Yet what is certain is that as much of Rome crumbled into ash, Nero saw not tragedy, but opportunity. For 6 days and 7 nights, the fire raged. It spared little. Of the 14 districts of Rome, only 4 escaped untouched. 3 were completely destroyed, while the rest lay in ruins. Temples collapsed, ancestral homes of the patricians disappeared, and centuries of history were consumed in smoke. The people, exhausted and broken, looked for a savior and instead found an emperor whose gaze was fixed not on their suffering, but on his own vision of glory. When the flames finally subsided, Rome was a skeleton. Families were homeless, the dead uncounted, the air thick with grief. It was then that Nero announced his grand plans. Rome would rise again, rebuilt not as it had been, but as he dreamed it should be. Wide streets would prevent future fires from spreading uncontrollably. Colonnades would line the boulevards. Marble would replace timber. And, at the heart of it all, he would construct his greatest creation, the Domus Aurea, the Golden House. The Domus Aurea was no mere palace. It was a monument to excess, a temple to Nero's vanity. Spanning nearly a mile of central Rome, it encompassed gardens, artificial lakes, banquet halls, and walls encrusted with gold, gems, and ivory. Frescoes painted with scenes of gods and heroes adorned the ceilings. Rooms were perfumed, and some were built with mechanical contraptions that allowed ceilings to rain down flower petals or release fragrances upon guests. In one of its halls, a colossal statue of Nero himself stood, styled after the sun god Apollo, towering over all who entered. To the people of Rome, still reeling from loss, this display of decadence was unbearable. Where they saw their homes destroyed and their families displaced, Nero saw only the blank canvas for his masterpiece. While children starved, he poured the empire's wealth into gold-leafed chambers. His vanity had crossed into cruelty, and the murmurs of dissent grew louder. But Nero was not content merely with bricks and mortar. He sought to immortalize himself through performance. He forced senators and nobles to attend his recitals, his musical competitions, his theatrical plays. The Emperor of Rome became a stage performer, demanding applause, demanding tears, demanding adoration. Few dared to criticize him openly, but in the shadows of Rome's ruined districts, resentment festered. It was then that Nero made one of the most infamous decisions of his reign. In order to deflect suspicion from himself regarding the fire, he cast blame upon a small, unpopular sect followers of a new faith known as Christianity. They were a strange people to the Romans, refusing to honor the gods, refusing to bow to the emperor's divinity. Already distrusted, they became convenient scapegoats. Nero declared them guilty of arson, of sacrilege, of treason. What followed was among the darkest episodes in Rome's history. Christians were rounded up, tortured, and executed in grotesque spectacles. Some were torn apart by wild beasts in the arenas. Others were crucified along the roadsides, their bodies left as warnings. Still others were coated in pitch and set, ablaze, serving as living torches to light Nero's gardens at night. The people, horrified yet cowed, understood the message. Dissent would be burned away as surely as the wooden streets of old Rome. Yet for all his cruelty, for all his extravagance, Nero remained blind to the storm gathering around him. He believed himself beloved, an artist misunderstood by lesser minds, a visionary fated to be vindicated by history. But history is rarely so kind. Rome's senators seethed under his humiliations. The legions loyal once to the Julio-Claudian line began to question their allegiance. In the provinces, murmurs of rebellion grew. The fire of Rome was more than a physical blaze. It was a metaphor for Nero's reign. He had consumed the city with his vanity, his hunger for beauty and glory. In its ashes, he had erected monuments not to Rome, but to himself, and in doing so, he had sown the seeds of his own downfall. As the years went on, Nero's grip weakened, conspiracies multiplied, plots thickened, allies turned into enemies. He had built his empire of gold and marble upon foundations of smoke and ash, and soon those foundations would crumble. But in this moment after the fire, amid the ruins, basking in the glow of his golden house, Nero could not see the end. He saw only himself, eternal, radiant, a god among men. Rome, however, had not forgotten, and Rome would not forgive. Chapter 8. The Shadow of Paranoia, a city in fear after the bloodletting of the Pisonian conspiracy. Rome no longer breathed freely. The very air of the city was heavy with suspicion. Whispers were not whispers, but potential daggers. A neighbor's silence could be treachery. A friend's hesitation could be betrayal. Nero's reign had entered a new phase. Fear was now the glue that bound the empire to his rule. The streets still bustled. The markets still rang with shouts. The amphitheaters still overflowed with cheering crowds. But beneath the noise was dread, an undercurrent that spread like rot in timber. Where once the people mocked Nero as the emperor who sang while Rome burned, they now lowered their voices when they spoke his name. Jokes could kill. Point 2. Nero. Transformation. The Nero who emerged after Piso's failed conspiracy was not the same man who once dreamed of being loved as an artist. He grew thinner, more hollow-eyed, more restless. Nights were spent pacing the marbled corridors of the Domus Aurea. Servants watched him mutter to himself, sometimes smiling, sometimes erupting in sudden fits of rage. He drank more heavily, indulged more recklessly, and yet trusted no one. Once, Nero had surrounded himself with poets, musicians, and philosophers. Now he surrounded himself with spies, informants, and executioners. The lyre was not abandoned, but it was joined by the sword. 3. The death of Papagene 65 CE. Tragedy or, perhaps cruelty struck the imperial household. Papaya Sabina, Nero's beloved wife, was pregnant with his child. She was beautiful, ambitious, manipulative, but for Nero, she had become his anchor. She soothed his paranoia, flattered his vanity, and whispered reassurances when the Senate glared too coldly. One evening, a quarrel erupted. Accounts differ. Some say it was a trivial matter, others that Papaya had dared to criticize Nero's extravagance. In his drunken fury, Nero struck her with a kick, a blow, or a violent shove. No one truly knew. Papaya fell, and with her, the unborn child. When the palace realized what had happened, it was too late. Rome's empress was dead, and the emperor himself had caused it. Nero's grief was real, but twisted. He arranged for a lavish funeral, embalming Papaya's body in spices, dressing her in the robes of a goddess, and lifting her memory to divine status. He wept in public, sang songs of mourning, and built temples in her name, but in private, he spiraled further into despair. He had killed the one woman he had loved, or at least believed he loved, and with her death, even the palace walls seemed colder. 4. Rome's murmurs to the people. The empress's death was another wound in their trust. Some pitied Nero, believing He was truly broken by grief. Others whispered the darker version, that the emperor had murdered his own wife. For Rome's nobility, the message was clear: if Nero could kill Popoya, in rage, what hope was there for them in reason? Every senator tightened his smile. Every general tightened his grip on the hilt of his dagger. 5. Paranoia. Made flesh. The emperor's paranoia began to show in grotesque ways. He ordered food tasters at every meal, even for simple bread and wine. Letters were intercepted and read. Guards were instructed to report even the faintest of rumors. But paranoia breeds paranoia. The more Nero tried to control, the more conspiracies he imagined. He began to suspect those closest to him, his advisors, his freedmen, even the Praetorian Guard who protected him. And worst of all, he began to suspect his own family. 6. The end. Of Octavia's ghost, though Popoya was gone, Nero could not entirely erase the shadow of his first wife, Octavia. Years before, he had accused her falsely of adultery and executed her. Yet among the people, she was still remembered fondly, the innocent princess, daughter of Claudius, victim of the emperor's cruelty. Now, as grief for Popoya spread, whispers of Octavia returned. Rome had lost 2 empresses because of Nero, haunted by the people's affection for his murdered wife. Nero intensified his persecution of anyone who dared speak her name. Statues of Octavia were destroyed. Her memory was condemned, erased from public spaces. But memory is not so easily killed. For the people, Octavia became a martyr of Nero's madness. 7. The severing of bonds. In the years that followed, Nero's paranoia widened. Anyone of noble blood who might be considered a rival was marked. His aunt, Domitia, was accused of treason and forced into suicide. His old nurse was executed for vague suspicions. Even the loyal Burrus, commander of the Praetorian Guard, and one of Nero's earliest protectors, had died earlier under mysterious circumstances. Some said poison. The circle around the emperor grew smaller and smaller, until it was no longer an imperial court, but a stage filled with actors. Too terrified to leave. Point 8. The people's bread and circus for the common people. Nero continued his policy of distraction. If paranoia ruled the palace, spectacle ruled the streets. Grand games were announced. Gladiatorial shows reached new heights of extravagance. Exotic animals, lions from Africa, crocodiles from Egypt, tigers from Parthia were paraded and slaughtered for Rome's amusement. The people cheered, but the cheers no longer came with loyalty. The bread and circus kept them fed, kept them distracted, but it could not keep them blind. The fire of 64 was not forgotten. The persecutions of Christians were not forgotten. The death of Piso and Seneca was not forgotten. The crowd still clapped. But like the Senate, they clapped out of habit, not love. 9. The artist on stage. Nero's greatest refuge became performance. He declared himself Rome's finest actor, singer, and lyre player. He arranged competitions where he himself would perform, and unsurprisingly always win. In Naples, he appeared on stage in Greek robes, singing tragedies before stunned audiences. In Rome, he forced senators to sit through endless recitals, their faces frozen in false admiration. But perhaps most humiliating for the nobility was his participation in athletic contests. Nero entered chariot races, declaring himself champion, even when he fell from his chariot mid-race. Officials were ordered to award him the crown anyway. For the Roman elite, it was unbearable. The emperor, who should have commanded armies and laws, was now parading himself as an actor, a role once deemed beneath slaves. But for Nero, it was salvation. On stage, he was adored, applauded, celebrated. For those brief moments, paranoia was forgotten. He was not emperor of Rome, but emperor of the theater. 10. Rome holds its breath. By 67 CE, the empire itself was restless. In the provinces, cracks were appearing. In Judea, rebellion brewed among the Jewish people. In Gaul, murmurs of discontent. echoed among the legions. In Spain, generals watched Rome's chaos with calculating eyes. But in Rome, the fear was internal. The people feared the emperor. The Senate feared execution. The generals feared suspicion. And Nero himself feared them all. The city, that had once conquered the world, was now a city of trembling hearts. Its fate tied to the whims of one man's paranoia. 11. The emperor, alone at night. Nero wandered the gilded halls of his palace. Servants followed at a distance, carrying torches. Statues of gods and heroes cast long shadows against the marble. He would pause before the great bronze mirrors, staring into his own reflection. Sometimes he saw a god, radiant and immortal. Other times, he saw a murderer, with blood on his hands, and fear in his eyes. In those moments, he would whisper to himself, sometimes in poetry, sometimes in curses. He was Emperor of Rome, Lord of the known world. Yet he was utterly, terrifyingly alone. 12. The calm before the storm, the death of Piso. Seneca, Lucan, Popoja, and countless others had left Nero seemingly invincible. His enemies were dead, his rivals silenced, his power absolute. But beneath the marble floors of the Golden House, the empire trembled. The Senate hated him, but feared him. The people mocked him, but obeyed him. The legions still marched, but their loyalty was not to Nero, it was to their generals. And generals, unlike philosophers, did not die quietly. The storm had not yet broken, but it gathered, dark and heavy, on the horizon. Chapter 9. The Emperor of Illusions. Rome's golden prison. By the year 66 CE, Rome glittered with Nero's dream-made stone, the Domus Aurea, the golden house. Built on the ruins of the fire, it was both palace and stage. Marble halls stretched 4 acres, fountains danced in courtyards, and golden tiles caught the sunlight like flames frozen in stone. At its heart stood a colossal statue of Nero himself, taller than any god, more imposing than Jupiter. But while the golden house dazzled the eyes, it also whispered of tyranny. The people saw not beauty, but arrogance. The Senate saw not glory, but humiliation. The empire's resources, drained to fund Nero's extravagance, left provinces taxed and soldiers restless. Rome glittered, but beneath the gold was rot. The year of the the emperor's hunger for recognition as an artist had grown insatiable. No longer content with Roman audiences, Nero announced a grand artistic tour of Greece. Greece, the land of Homer, Sophocles, Euripides. To Nero, it was sacred soil, the birthplace of the very art he craved to master. He declared himself competitor in every major festival: Olympia, Delphi, Corinth, Athens. He would sing, act, and race, and all Greece would witness the divine voice of their emperor. Rome was left stunned. An emperor was supposed to lead legions, not compete in theater. But who could stop him? The games of Greece in Greece. Nero was ecstatic. He performed tragedies on stage, often for hours, forcing audiences to remain seated until he finished, no matter how faint or weary they became. Guards blocked the exits to prevent anyone from leaving mid-performance. When he sang, he demanded silence so absolute that even women giving birth were carried out quietly, so as not to disturb his voice. He entered athletic contests as well, most famously the chariot race at Olympia. Nero's team of 10 horses thundered into the arena, extravagance never before seen. But during the race, Nero was thrown from his chariot by rules. He had lost, but rules meant nothing when the competitor was emperor. Judges, trembling, declared him victor anyway, crowning him with the olive wreath at the end of his tour. Nero declared Greece free of taxation, a gift in exchange for their applause. To him, it was proof that he was not merely emperor of Rome, but emperor of culture itself. To Rome, it was further proof that their ruler had abandoned reality for illusion. Rome without an emperor. While Nero basked in applause abroad, Rome grew uneasy. For months, The empire's true ruler was not the emperor, but his freedmen and bureaucrats. Corruption flourished, bribes determined justice. The Senate sat powerless, reduced to approving edicts written in Nero's absence. And across the empire, governors and generals began to whisper, Rome had no emperor in truth. This was dangerous ground, for Rome's strength lay in its legions, and legions followed generals, not applause. Shadows in Judea. While Nero sang in Greek theaters, revolt erupted in Judea. The Jewish people, long resentful of Roman rule, rose in open defiance. The Temple of Jerusalem became a fortress. Roman garrisons were slaughtered, and banners of rebellion flew in defiance of the empire. News reached Nero, but he barely flinched. He sent General Vespasian to crush the uprising and returned to his performances. Nero Judea was a nuisance, not a threat. To the empire, it was the spark of something larger, proof that Roman control was not eternal. The return to Rome. When Nero returned to Rome in 67 CE, he was intoxicated with triumph. He paraded his hundreds of crowns, his trophies, his titles. He declared himself not merely emperor, but victor of the world's greatest games. He forced the Senate to greet him, as if he had returned from a military campaign. Senators bowed as he displayed olive wreaths instead of captured enemies, golden lyres instead of conquered lands. But where Nero saw glory, Rome saw farce. The emperor returned, not as a Caesar, but as an actor, and actors in Roman eyes were the lowest of the low. The golden house filled with laughter, wine, and music. Outside its walls, resentment sharpened like a dagger. The fracture of trust. By now, the Senate's hatred of Nero was beyond repair. He had executed too many, humiliated them too often, and abandoned their dignity for spectacle. But worse, the legions no longer feared him. Soldiers had heard of their emperors singing, while generals bled in battlefields. They had seen resources diverted to games while provinces burned. The emperor's power rested on two pillars, Senate and legions. By 68 CE, both were cracked. Nero lived in illusions, but the empire lived in reality. The final paranoia's descent spread. Nero's paranoia deepened. He accused generals of treachery, senators of conspiracy, even his closest freedmen of betrayal. He ordered executions at the faintest suspicion. Informers grew rich, thriving on lies. Entire families were destroyed by whispers. One tale tells of a senator, condemned for simply gazing too long at Nero, during a performance's admiration, mistaken for mockery. Rome bled quietly. Fear became its daily bread. The whisper of rebellion, first open crack, came in Gaul. The governor, Gaius Julius Vindex, raised the standard of revolt, declaring Nero unworthy to rule. He called on other governors to join him, appealing not to the Senate but to the legions. Vindex's revolt was crushed swiftly, but its echo was louder than victory. Across the empire, others heard. Rebellion was possible in Spain. Governor Sulpicius Galba waited, cautious but watchful. In Africa, murmurs stirred. Even the Praetorian Guard, sworn to protect the emperor, grew restless. Nero laughed off the threat at first. He even composed songs mocking Vindex, but somewhere deep, in his hollow heart, he felt it. The applause was fading. The emperor as performer despite the looming storm. Nero clung desperately to his art. He announced plans for a grand performance in Rome, a festival greater than Greece, where the people would once again cheer his brilliance. It was as if he believed applause could drown out rebellion, that music could silence swords. But rebellion was not theater, and legions were not audiences. A Rome divided. By now, Rome itself was divided. The poor still loved Nero for his games, his spectacles, his promises of grain. For them, he was a strange but generous ruler. The elite despised him, the generals distrusted him, the Senate wished for his death but feared to move. And so the empire balanced on a knife's edge, held together by habit, not loyalty. the illusion of control in Nero's mind. He was untouchable. He believed himself a god, a hero, an artist beyond judgment. The Senate could plot, the generals could grumble, but Rome loved him. Rome must love him. Had they not cheered when he sang? Had they not crowned him champion? Had they not worshipped his image in golden halls? But the truth was simpler, harsher. The empire no longer belonged to Nero. It belonged to the legions, and the legions belonged to generals. The coming storm as 67 turned to 68 CE. The storm clouds gathered. Galba in Spain prepared his move. Vespasian in Judea tightened his grip. The Praetorian Guard whispered among themselves. Nero still sang, still raced, still feasted in his golden house. But outside, the empire marched to a different rhythm, the rhythm of war drums. The illusion could not hold forever. The Emperor of Illusions, Nero's reign, once marked by youthful hope and golden dreams, was now an empire of illusions. He believed applause was loyalty, but it was fear. He believed crowns were victories, but they were gifts. He believed Rome adored him, but Rome had grown tired. He had built theaters, not legions. He had conquered applause, not enemies. And in Rome, illusions never last. The edge of the abyss. By the end of 68 CE, Nero was still emperor in name. But already, the abyss opened beneath his feet. The provinces stirred. The Senate waited. The legions whispered. And for the first time in his reign, even the applause seemed hollow. The stage was set. The play of Nero's life had reached its final act. Chapter 10. The fall begins. Rome at a crossroads. The year was 68 CE, and Rome stood on the brink. For 14 years, Nero had ruled as emperor, but the empire no longer obeyed him with conviction. Rome glittered with the remnants of his dreams. The golden house still shimmered in sunlight, theaters still echoed with songs, and feasts spilled wine like rivers. Yet beneath this veneer of grandeur, cracks spread through the empire like fractures in marble. The Senate seethed in silence, waiting for courage. The legions, once Rome's unbreakable spine, bent toward new masters. And the people, weary of fire, famine, and spectacle, began to murmur that perhaps even emperors were mortal. Nero's illusions were breaking. The shadow of Galba in faraway Spain, Servius Sulpicius, Galba, governor of Hispania Tarraconensis, finally made his move. Galba was no young revolutionary. He was old, seasoned, cautious, but he was also respected by the legions under his command. Where Nero sought applause, Galba demanded discipline. Where Nero sang, Galba marched. In April of 68 CE, Galba declared himself not merely governor, but legate of the Senate and people of Rome, a subtle but unmistakable challenge. He stopped short of openly calling himself emperor, but the meaning was clear. Nero was no longer fit to rule. The echo of rebellion carried across provinces like thunder across valleys. Betrayal in the guard closer to Rome. Danger stirred within the very walls meant to protect Nero. The Praetorian Guard, elite soldiers who served as the emperor's bodyguards, had long been his shield. But Nero had neglected them. Their pay was irregular, their loyalty taken for granted, their commanders uneasy. Galba, wise in the ways of soldiers, offered them something Nero never could: gold and stability. Promises whispered into the ears of Praetorian officers turned into cracks in Nero's last line of defense. The Praetorian Guard, once his fortress, began to dream of his downfall. The emperor who laughed when news of Galba's defiance reached Nero. The emperor laughed. He mocked Galba as an old fool, frail and delusional. He composed verses lampooning him, reciting them at banquets for amusement. He assured his court that the legions of Rome would never abandon their rightful emperor for a dusty governor at the edge of Spain. But laughter could not stop the tide. Even as Nero sang, legions in Gaul and Africa watched, weighed, and began to lean away from their emperor. The Senate, though still silent, listened closely. The blood of senators. Nero's response to fear was always the same: execution, suspected conspirators. Senators with a glance too cold, generals with ambition too visible, all fell beneath his orders. One after another, noble families perished. Their estates were seized, their heirs scattered, their names condemned. But each death planted another seed of hatred. Even those who pretended loyalty whispered behind closed doors, "Better any man than Nero." A city uneasy in Rome. The people wavered, the poor still clung to Nero, for he gave them games and bread. The Colosseum roared with races and gladiators, spectacles he financed to win their cheers. But others remembered the fire. They remembered the grain shortages. They remembered the emperor singing while Rome burned. Love and hate, loyalty and resentment, tangled in the streets. The city itself seemed to hold its breath. The revolt of Vindex, the first true blow, came from Gaul. Gaius Julius Vindex, governor of Gallia Lugdunensis, had long despised Nero. He raised a banner of revolt, calling Galba the savior of Rome. His legions clashed with loyalist forces, and blood stained the fields of Gaul. Though Vindex was defeated and took his own life, the message had been delivered. Open rebellion against Nero was possible. The world had seen that Rome could defy its emperor and survive. The dream of rebellion spread. Nero's mind turned not to war, but to escape. He imagined fleeing to Egypt, land of ancient gods and mystery, where he could live as a performer without judgment. There, on the banks of the Nile, he dreamed of building a new stage, of becoming adored, not as emperor, but as artist. It was a fantasy, a dream spun from fear and delusion. But to Nero, it was more appealing than facing legions and conspirators. Rome, however, would not let him go so easily. The Senate awakens by June of 68 CE. Galba's revolt could no longer be ignored. The Senate, long cowed and broken, began to stir. For years they had bent beneath Nero's whims, watching colleagues executed, traditions mocked, and dignity stripped. Now, with Galba rising, they saw their chance. Whispers filled the Curia. If the legions turned, if the Praetorians wavered, the Senate could cast Nero aside. The emperor, once untouchable, was now vulnerable. The Praetorian oath, a decisive betrayal, came from within. Nero awoke one morning to find that the Praetorian Guard, his last shield, had sworn loyalty to Galba. Their prefect, Nymphidius Sabinus, declared Nero an enemy of Rome. The emperor's palace, once crowded with soldiers, stood eerily empty. Servants slipped away. Friends vanished into the night. Nero, who once commanded the world's mightiest empire, was abandoned. The emperor, alone in desperation. Nero fled the Golden House. With only a handful of loyal slaves, he rode through the night to the villa of one of his freedmen, Finn. There, in a darkened room, the emperor, who once commanded legions and sang to thousands, now cowered. Trembling at every sound, he asked his companions, "Do I still live, and am I still hated?" They gave no answer. The sentence of the Senate back in Rome. The Senate convened. With the Praetorian Guard on Galba's side, the choice was easy. They declared Nero a public enemy, condemned him to death, and erased his name from honor. The Senate that once bowed before him now signed his death warrant. The illusion was gone. Nero was emperor no longer. The last hours in Finn's villa, Nero's terror consumed him. He begged for courage, but could not summon it. He asked his companions to take his life for him, but none dared touch the emperor. He paced, wept, muttered fragments of verse, and cursed the fate that had betrayed him. Outside, the hoofbeats of soldiers grew nearer. Realizing there was no escape, Nero at last found a shred of resolve. With the help of a freedman, Epaphroditus, he pressed a dagger to his throat. His final words, whispered with bitter irony, were "Qualis artifex, perio, what an artist dies in me." With a final thrust, the emperor who sang as Rome burned fell, silent. The end of a dynasty. Nero's death ended more than a reign. It ended the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the line of emperors stretching back to Augustus himself. With his fall, the empire entered chaos. 4 men would rise and fall in a single year, a time remembered as the year of the 4 emperors. Rome had lost its singer, but it had also lost stability. The empire trembled on the edge of civil war. The legacy of fire in the end. What was Nero? A tyrant who murdered his family, or an artist trapped in the wrong role? A madman who set fire to Rome, or a misunderstood dreamer destroyed by power? History remembers him as the emperor who fiddled while Rome burned, though no fiddle ever touched his hands. His golden house, his statues, his songs, most were erased, destroyed by successors eager to bury his name. But the memory of Nero endured. To some, he was a monster. To others, a tragic soul. To all, he was a warning. For emperors, who mistake illusion for reality, are always doomed to fall. Chapter 11. The year of chaos. Rome, without a master. Nero's corpse lay in an unmarked grave, carried secretly by a few loyal freedmen who dared not honor him publicly. No funeral pyres, no grand processions, just silence, and Rome, suddenly, was leaderless. The empire that had stretched from Britannia's misty shores to Egypt's deserts now looked inward with unease. For more than a century, emperors had been chosen by blood descendants of Julius Caesar, Augustus, and their line. But with Nero's death, the Julio-Claudian dynasty was extinguished. Who would rule now? The answer did not come from the Senate, nor from the people of Rome. It came from the soldiers. Galba's triumph in Hispania. Galba received the news. Nero was dead. The Senate had proclaimed him emperor. The Praetorian Guard, bought with promises of gold, swore allegiance. At last, Galba had what he wanted, power, but his triumph was bitterly cold. He was old, weary, and unbending. Where Nero gave bread and circuses, Galba gave discipline and austerity. He believed Rome needed a father, not a showman. When he entered the city in October of 68 CE, there were cheers. But already, beneath the applause, dissatisfaction stirred. The people versus Galba. Rome was a city of memories. The people remembered Nero, not his cruelty, not his madness, but his games, his gifts, his open hand. To the poor, Nero had been the emperor who made them laugh and eat, who sang for them, who gave them races and theater. Galba, by contrast, cut off Nero's excesses. He canceled distributions of grain and money. He dismissed soldiers who expected rewards. He confiscated property from citizens accused of corruption. Discipline had returned, but joy had died. And the people, fickle and hungry, whispered that perhaps Nero had not been so bad after all. The discontent of the Guard, the Praetorian Guard, too, grew restless. They had sworn loyalty to Galba for gold, but Galba refused to pay what Nero had promised. He called them mercenaries, not soldiers, and demanded obedience without reward. The Guard, who had betrayed one emperor, began to consider betraying another. Ambition flickered in the hearts of men who wore the purple cloak of command. The ambitious Otho. Among them stood Marcus Salvius Otho, a man once close to Nero, once married to the infamous Poppaea Sabina. Before Nero had taken her for himself, Otho had supported Galba, believing he would be named successor. But Galba chose another, Lucius Calpurnius Piso, a young noble, bitter and vengeful. Otho turned to the Praetorian Guard. With bribes and promises, he won their loyalty. The stage was set for betrayal. Galba's end. On the 15th of January, 69 CE, Galba rode through the Forum, confident in his power. But the Praetorian Guard turned on him. They surrounded him, dragged him from his horse, and struck him down in the dirt. His head was paraded through the streets, mocked by the very people who had once cheered his arrival. The Senate, trembling once again, declared Otho emperor. In just 7 months, Nero's successor was dead. The chaos had only begun. Short reign. Otho promised the people what Galba had denied: generosity, games, feasts. He sought to restore Nero's memory, even speaking of honoring him. To the poor, this was a sign that the days of spectacle might return. But Otho's reign faced a greater danger: the provinces in Germania. The legions refused to accept Otho. They proclaimed their own emperor, Aulus Vitellius, a general beloved by his men for indulgence and leniency. Rome was now divided: 2 emperors, 2 armies, 1 empire. The march of Vitellius's legions marched from the Rhine, a tide of hardened soldiers, eager for plunder and glory. Otho, desperate to hold Rome, gathered forces and prepared for war. The empire trembled as Roman legions prepared to fight Roman legions. The Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, shattered beneath ambition. The Battle of Bedriacumen, April of 69 CE. The 2 forces clashed near the town of Bedriacumen, northern Italy. The battle was fierce, brutal, and fratricidal. Legion met legion, shield struck shield, brother fought brother. The field was drenched in Roman blood, not that of foreign enemies. Vitellius's forces triumphed. Otho, unwilling to drag the empire into civil war any longer, took his own life with dignity. His last words: "May the Roman people be spared." His reign had lasted only 3 months. Vitellius, the indulgent Vitellius, entered Rome as emperor, hailed by his soldiers, feared by the Senate, distrusted by the people. He was no statesman, no reformer. He was a man of appetite. Banquets stretched for days, fountains flowed with wine, golden dishes groaned with food. The emperor ate while the empire bled. Rome had traded Nero's spectacles for Vitellius's gluttony, but Vitellius's reign was already doomed. The rising of Vespasian in the east, in Judea, another general stirred. Titus Flavius Vespasian was a man of humble origins, but great skill. He had commanded legions with discipline and victory, earning the respect of soldiers and provinces alike. When Vitellius rose, the eastern legions declared for Vespasian. Egypt, Judea, and Syria swore loyalty. The empire fractured once again. Rome at war with itself. The year 69 CE became a nightmare. Galba dead, Otho dead, Vitellius ruling in Rome, while Vespasian claimed power in the east. Legions marched, provinces bled, cities burned. For the first time since the Republic, Rome's destiny hung on civil war. The empire that had conquered the world now devoured itself. The fall of Vitellius Vespasian's forces, led by his generals, advanced into Italy. The people of Rome, weary of Vitellius's excess, turned against him. The Senate, once more, betrayed its emperor. They declared for Vespasian, abandoning the man who had sat on the throne only months before. Vitellius fled through the palace, seeking escape, hiding in shame. He was dragged out, beaten, mocked, and executed in the Forum. His body was thrown into the Tiber, washed away like refuse. Vespasian's victory at last, the chaos ended. In December of 69 CE, the Senate proclaimed Vespasian emperor. The empire, shattered by civil war, found stability in the Flavian dynasty. Vespasian was no artist, no dreamer, no tyrant. He was practical, shrewd, and firm. Rome needed not spectacle, but survival. The shadow of Nero, and yet, even with new stability, ghost lingered in distant provinces. Pretenders arose, claiming to be Nero reborn. They sang, they wore his likeness, and they gathered followers who longed for the days of games and music. The false Neros, as they were called, haunted the empire for years. Some believed Nero had not died at all, but lived in hiding, waiting to return. To many, Nero was not just a tyrant. He was a symbol of a Rome that entertained, a Rome that dazzled. Even in death, he captivated imaginations. The lessons of chaos, the year of the 4 emperors, revealed a truth Rome had long ignored. Power did not belong to the Senate, nor to the people, but to the armies. Whoever commanded the legions ruled the empire. Nero had lost them. Galba had failed. Them Otho could not hold them. Vitellius had indulged them, then betrayed them. Only Vespasian secured them. From this year onward, emperors would rise and fall, not by birthright, but by the loyalty of soldiers. Rome rebuilt under Vespasian, order returned. The golden house of Nero was dismantled, its lavish halls filled with new structures. On its grounds, Vespasian began the construction of the Flavian amphitheater, the Colosseum, where Nero had built for himself. Vespasian built for the people. The Colosseum would stand as a monument, not to one man's vanity, but to Rome's endurance. The shadow of fire and tyranny faded, replaced by the stone of renewal. The end of the line thus ended the chaotic year. For emperors Galba Otho, Vitellius Vespasian, Rome had survived, though scarred. The people who once sang for Nero now looked to new rulers. But whispers of the artist emperor still flickered, carried in taverns and marketplaces, in provinces and distant lands. Nero was dead, yet in memory, in legend, he lived. The empire moves in Vespasian's reign marked the rise of a new dynasty. The Flavians, his sons, Titus and Domitian, would carry on his rule. Rome would march forward, building, conquering, thriving, but the lesson of 69 CE was never forgotten. Rome was strong, but fragile. Its emperors were mortal, its destiny uncertain, and always, in the minds of the people, lingered the question, was Nero truly gone? A world forever changed from Nero's flames to Galba's austerity, from Otho's desperation to Vitellius's gluttony, from civil war to Vespasian's stability. Rome had been transformed. The age of the Julio-Claudians was over. The empire was reborn in fire and blood, and Nero, though condemned, became eternal, for in the ruins of Rome, in the music of poets, in the whispers of crowds, the memory of the emperor who sang while Rome burned would never truly die. Chapter 12. The Fire That Changed Everything. The year was 64 AD, and Rome stood as the beating heart of an empire that stretched across the known world. It was a city of marble and mud, of temples and taverns, of senators and slaves. Every alley carried whispers of politics, ambition, and betrayal. Every forum echoed with the voices of philosophers and generals. Yet behind the grandeur lay fragility. The city was a labyrinth of wooden tenements, tightly packed markets, and crooked streets where fire could leap like a predator unleashed. And on one fateful July night, that predator was let loose. This is the story of the great fire of Rome, the inferno that destroyed the city, reshaped an empire, and forever chained the name of Emperor Nero to one of history's darkest accusations. The spark it began in the district of the Circus Maximus, a place usually filled with laughter, races, and cheers of the crowd. But on that night, the laughter was replaced by panic. Sparks ignited among the wooden stalls, perhaps from a careless torch, perhaps from something more deliberate. Within minutes, the flames roared to life, climbing walls, devouring roofs, and turning homes into ashdot. The fire leaped from street to street, as though guided by invisible hands. Rome was a city of contrasts: stone mansions beside flammable shacks, temples beside tenements. Once the fire started, there was no containing it. Ancient writers like Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio tell us the fire raged for 9 days. Some claimed it was chance, others whispered it was sabotage, and some pointed their finger at Nero. Nero's whereabouts on the night the fire began. Nero was not in Rome. He had retreated to his palace in Antium, a seaside town where he indulged in music and solitude. When news of the blaze reached him, accounts say he rushed back to the city, but by the time he arrived, Rome was already a sea of flames. People were running through smoke-filled streets, clutching what little they could save. Mothers carried children, slaves carried masters. Families wailed as temples collapsed. The emperor, witnesses claimed, stood on a high vantage point, watching his city burn. And here, history splits. Some accounts accuse him of madness, of strumming his lyre, singing of the fall of Troy, as the capital turned to cinders. The image of Nero fiddling while Rome burned became immortal. But others argue he was moved to tears, horrified at the devastation. Which is true? We may never know. But in the ruins of that fire lay the seeds of Nero's downfall. A city in ruins when the flames finally died. 2/3 of Rome was destroyed. Entire neighborhoods were gone. Families who had lived in the same streets for generations found nothing but blackened rubble. The gods' temples had fallen. Ancient shrines and sacred relics turned to dust. But even in despair, there were whispers. Many swore they had seen men running through the streets, spreading the fire. Some said they had been ordered to keep citizens from putting out the flames. Whispers of imperial agents, Nero's agents. Why? The whispers grew into accusations that Nero wanted a clean slate, that he longed to rebuild Rome in his own vision, a city not of cramped alleys and wooden shacks, but of marble, order, and grandeur. A city that would bear his name. Nero's new Roman Dade. After the fire, Nero unveiled plans for a new Rome. Roads would be widened. Buildings would be constructed with fireproof stone. Public spaces would expand. And towering above it all would rise his greatest dream, the Domus, Area, or Golden House. It was a palace, unlike any the empire had seen. Glittering halls, artificial lakes, gardens sprawling like kingdoms, and a colossal statue of Nero himself, rising higher than any god to his enemies. This was proof enough. The fire was not misfortune, it was convenience. Nero had burned Rome only to rebuild it in his own name, but Nero was clever. He needed someone else to blame, and so he turned his gaze upon a small, growing sect, despised by many, the Christians. The scapegoats at the time, Christians were seen as strange, secretive, even dangerous. They refused to worship Rome's gods. They spoke of a kingdom beyond this world. Too many Romans. They were atheists, traitors, and a threat to social order. Nero declared them guilty of the fire. The punishment was brutal. Some Christians were sewn into animal skins and thrown to wild dogs. Others were crucified. Many were covered in tar and set ablaze human torches, burning to light Nero's gardens at night. This was more than punishment. It was theater. It was fear turned into spectacle. And it marked the beginning of one of history's most infamous persecutions. The question of guilt. But did Nero really start the fire? The truth is slippery. Ancient sources disagree, and many wrote with hatred toward him. Tacitus himself, who despised Nero, admitted there was no proof of his involvement. It may have been an accident, one of many fires that plagued ancient cities. But Nero's behavior, his grand ambitions, his obsession with being remembered as a god among men, left him forever tied to the blaze. And yet, to the Roman people who lost everything, none of that mattered. What mattered was that the emperor built his palace upon their ashes. The turning tide, the great fire, marked a shift in Nero's reign. Once beloved as a youthful, promising ruler, he was now seen as monstrous, disconnected, and dangerous. The Golden House was not a palace of beauty, was a monument to his arrogance. The Senate, once cautious of him, began to seethe in silence. The people, once his adoring crowd, began to whisper against him. Even the gods, it seemed, had abandoned Nero. What followed was a spiral of paranoia, cruelty, and bloodshed, a legacy of Flames the Great. Fire of Rome was more than a tragedy, it was the crucible that revealed Nero's true face. Whether guilty or innocent, he emerged from it as history's arsonist, the emperor who let his empire burn for glory. His name became forever linked with fire, excess, and tyranny. And though centuries have passed, the image of Nero with a lyre in hand, Rome burning behind him, remains etched into the human imagination, because in that moment, Whether true or myth, Nero stopped being a man. He became a symbol of the danger when power, ambition, and madness collide. Closing narration. Rome rose from the ashes, rebuilt stronger than before. But its people never forgot the flames, nor the man who watched them. Did Nero burn his own Capitol to build his golden Rome, or was he simply cursed by fate, painted by history as the arsonist of an empire? The answer may be lost in the smoke of that ancient fire, but the question still haunts us. Chapter 13. The Golden House of a Tyrant. The fire had gutted Rome, where bustling markets and crowded tenements once stood. There were now scorched ruins and blackened skeletons of buildings. For ordinary Romans, the catastrophe meant the loss of homes, family shrines, and livelihoods. But for Nero, it meant opportunity. The emperor looked upon the ruins not with grief, but with vision. Where others saw destruction, he saw a blank canvas, an empty stage upon which he could craft his masterpiece, the Domus Aurea, the Golden House. This was not merely a palace. It was an empire within an empire, a world designed to glorify Nero alone. The dream of a god, Nero had always been obsessed with spectacle. He loved performance, music, poetry. He longed to be adored not as a politician or general, but as an artist. To him, Rome was not a city of the people, was a stage for his genius. The Golden House was the ultimate performance. It would be a monument to his power, his taste, his divinity. No emperor before him had dared dream so extravagantly. According to ancient descriptions, the palace sprawled over vast acres of central Rome. Gardens stretched like rolling fields. There were vineyards, meadows, forests, and even an artificial lake large enough to mimic the sea. In its center stood the heart of the Golden House, a massive complex of halls, dining rooms, and chambers that gleamed with marble, ivory, and precious stones. Walls were gilded with gold leaf. Ceilings dripped with jewels. In one dining room, panels of ivory could slide open to sprinkle flower petals and perfume upon guests. Another featured a rotating ceiling, designed to mimic the movement of the heavens, and towering at the entrance was a statue of Nero himself, the Colossus rising over 100 feet into the air, a god made flesh in bronze. Rome reacts. For the people of Rome, the Golden House was an insult carved in gold. Their homes had been reduced to ash, yet their emperor built for himself a palace fit for Olympus. The whispers grew louder, that Nero had burned the city only to claim the land. For this monstrous dream, what was once rumor now seemed undeniable. Truth. Ordinary citizens trudged past the palace walls, staring at a paradise they would never enter. Senators gritted their teeth, forced to praise halls that mocked their authority. Rome's treasury, already strained, bled further to pay for Nero's indulgence. The city belonged to him now, not to the people, not to the gods, but to Nero. Ego. Nero, the artist. But Nero was not content with marble and gold. He wanted recognition, not as emperor, but as artist. He took to the stage, performing music and poetry before audiences who dared not criticize him. He entered competitions across Greece, demanding victories. No one could defeat him, not because of talent, but because of fear. The Emperor of Rome, ruler of the greatest empire on earth, craved applause like a starving man craves bread. He was intoxicated not by power itself, but by validation. And yet, the more he indulged, the more Rome despised him. An emperor who performed on stage was seen as shameful, unworthy. The Senate whispered that he degraded the dignity of his office. The people muttered that he cared more for songs than for governance. The cost of grandeur. The Golden House had drained Rome's resources. Taxes grew heavier. Discontent spread among the provinces. Soldiers muttered about their pay being siphoned into gilded halls instead of their pockets. Even allies of Nero began to distance themselves. He had crossed a dangerous line, the line between eccentricity and tyranny. The more extravagant his palace became, the more fragile his reign grew. For an emperor, appearances were everything, and Nero's appearance was now that of a man who ruled for himself alone. Shadows in the golden halls, yet inside the domus aurea, Nero lived in a world of fantasy. He surrounded himself with flatterers who fed his ego, artists who pretended to worship his talent, and courtiers who dared not speak truth. But even within those gilded walls, Nero could not silence the shadows. Whispers of conspiracy seeped into Rome. Senators who had once tolerated him now plotted in secret. Generals in the provinces watched with disgust. The Praetorian Guard, Rome's elite protectors, wondered if their emperor had lost his mind. The Golden House was not a symbol of victory. It was a fortress of isolation. Nero had made himself untouchable, but also alone, a monument to madness to historians. The domus aurea became the perfect metaphor for Nero's reign, dazzling, excessive, visionary, and utterly detached from reality. Its splendor could not disguise the truth. Rome had suffered for his vanity. Its citizens hated him. Its senators feared him. Its empire weakened under the weight of his obsession. And yet, when Nero walked those golden corridors, gazed upon jeweled ceilings, and stood before his colossal statue, he saw not a tyrant, but a god. He believed the Golden House would make him immortal. Instead, it made him infamous. Closing narration. The fire had given Nero a city of ash. From that ash, he built a palace of gold. But in seeking to create a Rome that reflected only himself, he severed the bond between emperor and people. The domus aurea was not a house of triumph, it was a tomb for Nero's reputation. And within its golden walls, the seeds of his destruction were already taking root. Chapter 14. The Blood of the Conspirators. The golden walls of the domus aurea shimmered in the torchlight, but outside those gates, Rome was restless. The empire whispered of betrayal, of plots, of daggers hidden in the folds of togas. For years, resentment against Nero had been simmering in silence. Now, it began to boil. Shadows in the Senate. The Senate was no longer united. Some bowed to Nero's whims, smiling as he performed in theaters and built palaces of gold. Others seethed, quietly, their dignity wounded. Rome had once been ruled by emperors who led armies, expanded borders, and preserved traditions. Nero, instead, sang on stage and demanded applause. Among the senators, discontent hardened into resolve. They feared what Rome was becoming, what their emperor represented. It was no longer simply a question of politics, it was survival. If Nero's madness continued, the empire itself could crumble. And so, the first threads of conspiracy were woven. The Pisonian conspiracy. History remembers it as the Pisonian conspiracy, named after Gaius Calpurnius Piso, a wealthy and respected senator. Piso was everything Nero was not: dignified, measured, and beloved by many of Rome's elite. Where Nero embodied chaos, Piso represented stability. The plan was simple, yet dangerous: assassinate Nero and replace him with Piso. It was not merely a plot against a man, it was an attempt to restore Rome's dignity. But conspiracies in Rome were fragile things. Too many people involved meant too many opportunities for betrayal. The conspiracy grew, involving senators, officers, and even members of Nero's own household. Each man whispered promises of loyalty. Each dreamed of Nero's downfall. Yet, like so many webs, it was too large to hold. A freedman, fearful of the risks, revealed the plot. Nero's informers pounced, dragging names from lips with promises, threats, and torture. Soon, the entire conspiracy unraveled. The emperor had his excuse, and when Nero had an excuse, blood always followed. The trials of terror. Rome was thrown into terror as arrests swept through the city. Senators were dragged from their homes. Soldiers who had sworn loyalty were accused of treachery. Even poets and philosophers were not spared, for Nero saw danger in words as much as in daggers. The trials were public, brutal performances. Men of noble rank stood trembling before Nero's court, forced to defend themselves against accusations they could not refute. Some begged for mercy. Others stood proud, refusing to grovel before the emperor they despised. It mattered little. Nero demanded blood. Executions followed swiftly. Some conspirators were strangled. Others were forced to open their own veins in ritual suicide. Piso himself, the man who had dared to challenge Nero's throne, was compelled to take his own life. Rome's streets ran with the blood of its nobility. Seneca's last breath among the victims was a man Nero had once admired, perhaps even loved. Seneca, the philosopher and former tutor of the emperor. Seneca had shaped Nero in his youth, guiding him with wisdom and restraint. But over the years, Nero had grown distant, resentful of his mentor's authority. When the conspiracy was uncovered, Seneca's name was drawn into the net not because he wielded daggers, but because he had influence. Nero offered him no trial. Instead, Seneca was ordered to end his life. The philosopher met his fate with calm dignity. He slit his veins, speaking words of consolation to his grieving family. As the blood drained from his body, he declared that virtue was stronger than tyranny, that philosophy outlived cruelty. Nero, sitting within his golden palace, may have silenced his teacher, but in doing so, he unleashed an echo that would haunt his name forever. Rome trembles. The purge spread fear across every corner of Rome. No one was safe, not senators, not generals, not even family members. To be close to Nero was to risk destruction. The people of Rome watched in silence. They dared not speak against the emperor. 4 spies lingered in taverns and markets, listening for the faintest hint of dissent. But silence did not mean loyalty. In their hearts, the Romans despised him more than ever. Nero's paranoia, the conspiracy, had been crushed. But Nero was not satisfied. Instead, it deepened his paranoia. He saw assassins in every shadow. He mistrusted his advisors, his friends, even his guards. Each night, he wondered if tomorrow's dawn would bring a blade to his throat. The emperor, who once basked in applause, now trembled at whispers. The man who built golden palaces now feared to sleep within them. And yet, in his paranoia, Nero struck harder. He eliminated rivals before they could rise. He silenced critics before they could speak. With every act of violence, he believed he was protecting himself. In truth, he was only isolating himself further. The Pisonian conspiracy had failed, but its failure marked a turning point. Nero had defeated his enemies, yet in his victory, he revealed his weakness. The emperor, who once longed for love now, ruled by fear alone. Rome had become his prison, its people, his captives, its nobility, his victims. In destroying the conspirators, Nero had not saved his reign, he had set it upon the path of no return. Chapter 15. The shadow of madness. The flames of conspiracy had been extinguished, but they left behind smoke that choked Rome. The Pisonian conspiracy was crushed, its leaders executed, its whispers silenced. Yet in victory, Nero found no peace. The blood of Piso, Seneca, and countless others did not cleanse his fears. It poisoned them. Rome now belonged entirely to Nero's paranoia, the emperor's fear in the golden halls of the Domus Aurea. Nero paced like a prisoner. His guards kept watch at every doorway, yet he trusted none of them. Even the most loyal faces seemed suspicious. "Who speaks of me?" he asked endlessly. "What do they say?" Informers swarmed the palace, each eager to sell their neighbors secrets in exchange for favor. They whispered into Nero's ear of plots, of slanders, of dangers lurking unseen. The emperor rewarded them with gold and then executed them when their usefulness expired. Rome had become a city of shadows, where every man feared the betrayal of his friend, his wife, his servant. And at the heart of it all was Nero, trapped in a web of his own making. The fall of Octavia, one of the most tragic victims of Nero's madness, was his first wife, Octavia, daughter of the beloved Emperor Claudius. Though Octavia was blameless, Nero despised her. She was a reminder of a Rome that valued dignity and tradition, qualities Nero no longer embodied. He accused her of infertility, of betrayal, of crimes she had never committed. The people loved Octavia, and when Nero exiled her, Rome erupted in outrage. Crowds filled the streets, demanding her return. They cried out against Poppaea, Sabina, Nero's mistress and later wife, whom many blamed for Octavia's downfall. For a brief moment, it seemed the people's voice might prevail, but Nero's cruelty was relentless. He accused Octavia of a charge without evidence and ordered her execution. The young empress was taken to a secluded island. There, her veins were cut, and when death came too slowly, she was suffocated in steam. Her head was sent back to Poppaea as proof. The people of Rome wept, but they could do nothing. Nero had silenced their protests with blood, Poppaea's triumph and tragedy with Octavia gone. Poppaea Sabina became Nero's empress. Beautiful, ambitious, and cunning, she seemed to hold the emperor's heart. She whispered into his ear, feeding his paranoia, guiding his vengeance. Together, they indulged in luxury, while Rome trembled. But Poppaea's triumph was short-lived. In one of Nero's infamous rages, their marriage turned violent. The stories differ. Some say it was a quarrel, others, a moment of drunken fury. But the result was the same. Nero struck Poppaea while she was pregnant, and she collapsed, lifeless. The emperor, who longed for love, had killed the woman he adored. Nero wept for her. Yes, but his grief was twisted. He ordered Poppaea, embalmed with rare perfumes, placed in a golden tomb, and worshipped as a goddess. Yet Rome saw through the display. They knew the truth. The emperor had murdered his own wife, and not even divine honors could erase it. A city, in chains with each act of cruelty. Rome slipped deeper into fear. Senators bowed lower. Generals kept silent. The people watched from the shadows, whispering of a ruler who had lost his soul. Festivals became mandatory spectacles, where applause for Nero was demanded, not given freely. To fail to cheer loudly enough was dangerous. A smile could mean survival. A frown could mean death. Rome was no longer the heart of an empire, it was a stage, and its people unwilling actors in Nero's endless performance. The artist Emperor still, Nero dreamed of glory, not military conquest, not governance, but art. He declared himself the greatest singer, the greatest actor, the greatest poet of Rome. He forced the nobility to attend his performances, hours-long spectacles where he sang and played while no one dared to leave the theater. Women gave birth in the aisles, men pretended to faint, yet still, they stayed because to leave before Nero ended was to risk death in Greece. Nero competed in the Olympic Games. Naturally, he won every prize. Even in contests where he failed to finish, the emperor, who could not control his empire, demanded crowns of laurel as though he had conquered the world. But behind the applause lay mockery. Rome's generals laughed in secret. Its soldiers gritted their teeth. The emperor was making a fool of himself and of Rome itself. Cracks in the empire. While Nero played the artist, the empire suffered. Provinces groaned under taxes to fund his luxuries. The army grew restless, feeling ignored and disrespected. Governors in faraway lands whispered of rebellion. The loyalty that had once held the empire together was unraveling, and Nero, blinded by his vanity, could not see it. By now Nero was no longer simply feared, he was despised. The emperor, who had once been Rome's golden youth, was now its curse. His paranoia had turned into cruelty, his cruelty into madness. He had killed his wife, his mentor, and countless nobles. He demanded applause while his empire crumbled. Yet in the heart of Rome, silence reigned. For the people of Rome knew the shadow of madness had only begun to spread. Chapter 16. Rebellion at the edge of empire. The empire was vast, too vast for one man's madness to remain unnoticed. While Nero sang on gilded stages, the provinces bled under taxes, soldiers went unpaid, and whispers of defiance spread like sparks in a dry forest. The seeds of revolt began in the distant provinces, where Rome's reach was long but not eternal. In Gaul, the governor Julius Vindex grew restless. He saw the emperor's vanity, his cruelty, his neglect of duty. To Vindex, Rome was being poisoned, and its cure could not come from within the corrupted heart of the city. Vindex raised the banner of rebellion, calling upon the Gallic tribes and the legions stationed there. His cry was not for chaos, but for liberation from Nero's tyranny. Rome deserves a ruler, he declared, not a performer, an emperor, not an actor. The spark of Spain far to the southwest, in Hispania Tarraconensis, another figure watched with interest, Servius Sulpicius Galba, governor of Spain. He was old, stern, and disciplined, a soldier of the old Roman school. Galba had once been loyal to Nero, but loyalty had limits. When Vindex reached out to him, Galba hesitated. To defy the emperor was to risk everything, but to remain silent was to betray Rome itself. In secret councils, Galba listened to the voices urging him forward. Senators in exile, commanders weary of Nero's games. Even men within the Praetorian Guard all whispered the same thing. Nero must fall. Nero's reaction. News of rebellion reached Rome. At first, Nero dismissed it with laughter. Vindex scoffed. A petty governor in a far-off land dares to challenge Nero. Let him scream to the winds. I shall answer with music. But as reports grew, darker, of legions marching, of governors uniting, Nero's laughter turned to rage. He demanded loyalty from his generals, yet many hesitated. He called for punishment, yet the provinces ignored him. The emperor, who once commanded fear, now found his orders questioned. The battle of Vesontio. Vindex's revolt came to a head at Vesontio, modern Byzantium. The legions loyal to Nero, led by Lucius Virginius Rufus, clashed with Vindex's forces. The battle was brutal. Roman against Roman, sword against sword. In the end, Vindex was defeated. His forces scattered, and he himself took his own life, unwilling to face capture. Nero celebrated the news as if the rebellion had been crushed, but he failed to see the truth. Vindex's death was not the end, it was the beginning. His call for resistance had awakened the empire. Galba Declatus. Galba, once hesitant, now stepped forward. From Spain, he declared himself not a rebel, but the savior of Rome. He no longer called Nero emperor, he called him public enemy. His declaration was bold, dangerous, and irreversible, yet it resonated across the provinces. Others began to rise. In Africa, in Gaul, in the East, the empire was no longer united under Nero's name. It was fracturing. The Praetorian Guard turns. The final blow came not from distant provinces, but from within Nero's very walls. The Praetorian Guard, the emperor's personal protectors, grew restless. Their loyalty had always been bought with gold, but Nero's treasury was empty, drained by his spectacles and palaces. Galba, cunning, promised the guard rich rewards if they turned to him. Money spoke louder than fear. In secret meetings, officers of the guard pledged themselves not to Nero, but to Galba. Rome itself was slipping from the emperor's grasp. Nero's panic when the truth dawned on him. Nero's bravado crumbled. The man who once boasted of godlike power now trembled in fear. He raged, he wept, he begged. "Will no one stand with me?" he cried. But the Senate turned against him. The generals betrayed him. The people, once cowed, now shouted for his downfall. Alone in the golden halls of his palace, Nero heard the echo of rebellion closing in. The empire that had once bent to Nero's will now bent no more. From the provinces came defiance, from the guard came betrayal, from the Senate came condemnation. The emperor, who had played at being immortal now, faced his mortality. The fires he had lit in Rome were nothing compared to the flames of rebellion consuming the empire, and as those flames grew, the shadow over Nero deepened. His end was no longer a question of if, but when. Chapter 17. The Fall of the Golden Emperor. The last illusions of power. Nero once believed himself untouchable. He had paraded through Rome in purple robes, sung before cheering crowds, and forced senators to bow at his feet. He had imagined his name etched alongside Augustus, his reign as eternal as marble. But by the summer of 68 those illusions shattered. The Senate branded him Hostis Publicus, a public enemy. The Praetorian Guard abandoned him. The provinces raised banners against him. And in the streets of Rome, the whispers that had once been silenced now turned into chants. Down with Nero. Long live Galba. The emperor's golden stage was collapsing. The flight into darkness when the Praetorian Guard deserted. Nero's world caved in. He had always trusted their loyalty, believing gold and spectacle were enough to bind them. But now, the barracks were silent. The men who once guarded his life refused even to see him. In panic, Nero fled the palace. He disguised himself in worn clothes, covering his face with a hood. Only a handful of freedmen remained with him, loyal, not out of love, but out of fear and habit. Through the shadows of Rome, the once great emperor crept like a fugitive. He reached the villa of Finn, a trusted servant. There, outside the city walls, Nero hid, trembling at every sound, certain that soldiers were already marching to drag him in chains. The emperor's breakdown in the villa. Nero's mind unraveled. He raved about betrayal. He cursed. Galba cursed. The Senate cursed the guard. But more than anything, he cursed the people of Rome for abandoning him. Have I not given them games? He cried. Have I not given them music, spectacles, beauty beyond measure? And this is how they repay me. Like beasts turning on their master. Yet beneath his rage lay terror. The Senate's declaration meant death. No emperor branded public enemy could survive. He knew what awaited. A humiliating execution in the Forum, stripped of dignity. Paraded before the jeering masses he once entertained, he could not bear it. The Last Supper. Nero demanded food, but could not eat. He ordered music, but could not sing. His hands shook. His voice cracked. His breath came in shallow gasps. In a moment of clarity, he asked for a shallow grave to be prepared, lined with marble, filled with perfumes and silk. Even in death, he longed for extravagance. But the villa was no stage. His companions watched as the Emperor of Rome paced like a caged animal, muttering to himself, clutching his throat as if already feeling the blade. The sound of hoofs at dawn. News arrived. Soldiers were coming. The Senate had ordered Nero to capture Galba, was on his way to Rome. The empire had already moved on. The sound of distant hooves reached the villa. Nero froze. The color drained from his face. Is this how I end? He whispered. He begged his companions to kill him, to spare him the shame of capture. None dared. They stood silent, afraid of history's weight upon their hands. The final act. With trembling hands, Nero grasped a dagger. He pressed it against his throat, then pulled away, weeping. Again and again he tried, but the will to strike failed him. At last, as the soldiers drew near, he turned to his secretary, Epaphroditus. Help me, he pleaded. Together, they drove the blade into Nero's neck. The emperor gasped, choked, and fell. His final words, whispered through blood, were, Qualis, artifex, perio. What an artist dies in me. The aftermath. When the soldiers arrived, it was over. The emperor, who had once ruled the greatest empire on earth, lay lifeless in a servant's villa, his body shaking in its final spasms. Rome did not weep. The people celebrated in the streets. The Senate declared a new dawn. Statues of Nero were torn down, his name spat upon. Yet not all hated him. Some mourned the man who had entertained them, who had dared to live as more than just a ruler. For, better or worse, Nero had been unlike any emperor before him. Legacy of fire and madness with Nero's death, the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the line of Augustus ended. Rome would never again see an emperor so extravagant, so theatrical, so consumed by both genius and madness. But his legacy was not peace. The empire plunged into chaos. The year of the 4 emperors began, a storm of civil war that would shake Rome to its core, and through it all, Nero's name lived on. To some, he was the Antichrist, the beast foretold in prophecy. To others, a tragic artist misunderstood by history. Legend spread that he had not died, that he would return to reclaim his throne. Across the empire, whispers of Nero, haunted the years to come. Thus ended the reign of Nero, the emperor who burned Rome, who sang while the world turned to ash. He sought immortality through art, but found only infamy through fire. In the echo of his final words, "What an artist dies in me," lies the truth of his reign, a man who longed to be adored, but was remembered as a monster. The empire moved on, but the shadow of Nero lingered, dark and eternal. Chapter 18. Rome without Nero. The silence after the storm when Nero's lifeless body lay in Finn's villa. The echoes of his reign still lingered. For years, Rome had lived beneath his spectacles, the games, the music, the fire, the grand illusions. Now, suddenly, it was silent. The people poured into the streets, but not to mourn. Many cheered, others jeered. For some, relief was the truest emotion. They had lived under the shadow of an emperor who could destroy with a whim. But Rome without Nero was not Rome at peace. The empire was shaken, uncertain, trembling on the edge of something darker. The Senate's decreed. The Senate moved swiftly. They confirmed Nero's death, stripping his name from honor, condemning him as a tyrant. His statues were toppled, his likeness destroyed, his memory cursed. Yet the senators themselves were not united. Many had once bowed before him, praising him as a god, terrified of his wrath. Now, with him gone, they spoke boldly, as if they had never trembled in his presence. It was the Roman way, survival through shifting loyalty. Still, his curse weighed heavy. For centuries, his name would be remembered not as emperor, but as a warning. Galba's rise into the vacuum stepped Servius. Sulpicius Galba, the aging governor of Hispania, declared emperor by his troops even before Nero's death. He now entered Rome as the supposed savior. But Galba was no Nero. He had no gift for spectacle, no charm for the people, no fire in his heart. He was strict, cold, more soldier than statesman. To the Senate, he was ordered. To the people, he was disappointment. And in that gap, the empire's stability began to unravel. The people's strange mourning, though the Senate cursed Nero and Galba tightened control. Many among the lower classes grieved. The poor, the entertainers, the chariot fans, they remembered Nero's generosity. He had given them bread, games, music. He had walked among them not as emperor, but as performer. For all his cruelty, he had made them feel seen. Now Galba cut their rations, cancelled festivals, and demanded discipline. The contrast was sharp, bitter. Some whispered, Nero was better. The myth of Nero redivivus. Then came the rumors. Whispers spread that Nero had not died at all. Some said the soldiers, who found his body, had been deceived, that the corpse was not his. Others claimed he had fled east, to Parthia, where he was gathering an army to reclaim his throne. So powerful was this myth that in the years after his death, 3 impostors arose, each claiming to be Nero returned. The people called this belief Nero redivivus, Nero reborn. To his enemies, it was madness. To his followers, it was hope. The year of the 4 emperors. Nero's death did not bring peace, but chaos. His fall unleashed a storm known as the Year of the 4 Emperors, a cycle of blood and betrayal. Galba ruled first, but his strictness bred hatred. Otho, once Nero's companion, overthrew him. Then came Vitellius, backed by German legions. Finally, Vespasian, commander in the east, rose victorious. Rome devoured itself in civil war. A fitting aftermath for Nero's theatrical collapse. In this storm, many looked back on Nero's reign with twisted nostalgia. He may have been cruel, but at least he was one man. Now Rome had too many masters, and none as dazzling. How Rome remembered Nero in the years that followed. Nero became legend. To the Senate, he was a monster symbol of excess, tyranny, and madness. To the people, he remained a figure of fascination, a ruler who had blurred the line between emperor and artist. The Christians cast him as the beast of Revelation, the Antichrist who persecuted the faithful. His name, when written in Hebrew letters, even added up to 666, 4 centuries. Christians would whisper that Nero's ghost lingered, that he would rise again to bring destruction. To others, he was remembered in song and rumor. Minstrels sang of his music, of his golden palace, of the fire that consumed Rome. His legend spread far beyond the empire's borders, carried by traders, soldiers, and slaves. The shadow of the golden house, the Domus, Aurea, Nero's golden house, became the greatest symbol of his reign, built upon the ruins of the fire. It stretched across the city like a monument to arrogance. After his death, emperors could not bear it. Some destroyed its treasures, others built over it, burying its golden walls beneath new monuments. Yet in secret, whispers told of hidden chambers, of frescoes shimmering in torchlight, of a palace still breathing beneath the earth. Even buried, the golden house haunted Rome, as if Nero's spirit lingered within its gilded halls, a memory that refused to die. The truth of Nero's legacy is paradoxical. He was hated and loved, condemned and adored, destroyed, yet immortalized. No emperor before or after embodied such contradiction. His reign was a warning, yet his story remained irresistible. Even centuries later, medieval scribes wrote of him, and Renaissance artists painted him. His name echoed in opera, literature, prophecy. He had wanted to be remembered forever. In that, he succeeded. Rome without Nero was not Rome. Restored it was Rome uncertain. Rome bleeding, Rome searching for balance. His death ended a dynasty, but began a myth. For centuries, the shadow of Nero haunted the empire, from the whispers of false prophets to the buried halls of the Golden House. In life, he had burned with madness. In death, he refused to fade. For some, Nero was the beast. For others, the artist. For all, he was unforgettable. Chapter 19. The Curse of Nero. A city, haunted Rome had survived Nero, but it had not escaped him. Years after his suicide, the city still felt his presence. The Colossus, his massive bronze statue, loomed above the city like a silent god. The ruins of the Golden House whispered of gold and sin. The memory of fire still clung to the city walls. The senators could curse him, the emperors could erase his name, but the common people carried him in their hearts. And so Rome was haunted not by Nero's body, but by his myth. The ghost of the stage Nero had always dreamed of being remembered, not as emperor, but as artist. He had once said, "When I am gone, let people speak, not of my conquests, but of my songs." Strangely, that dream came true. Minstrels wandered from tavern to tavern, singing of his music, his voice, his spectacles. They told of the emperor who danced upon the stage, who sang with fire behind him, who defied the dignity of Rome for the glory of applause. To the poor, Nero was a legend, a man who blurred the line between ruler and performer. To them, his cruelty was forgiven in the memory of his theater. The Christian memory But for the Christians, Nero was no hero. They remembered the flames, the executions, the cruelty of the circus. To them, he was the persecutor who had painted Rome with Christian blood. In their writings, he became the beast of the apocalypse, the enemy of God, the figure of destruction. When the book of Revelation was copied and spread, readers found hidden codes in his name. In Hebrew, the numbers of Nero Caesar added to 666 the number of the beast. For centuries, every tyrant would be compared to Nero, and every time the world shook, whispers returned, perhaps Nero has risen again. Nero redivivus, the return of the emperor indeed. 3 men in the years after his death dared to claim that they were Nero himself. The first appeared in Greece, gathering musicians and actors, declaring he had returned to reclaim his throne. Crowds cheered, believing the impossible. The rebellion was crushed, but the story lived on. The second emerged in Asia Minor, claiming the scars of Nero's face, the gift of his voice. Some Parthian rulers even supported him, hoping to destabilize Rome. Again, he was defeated. The third came decades later, and by then the rumor was so strong that many believed it without question. For them, Nero had never died. He had only gone east, waiting, preparing, ready to rise in vengeance. This myth of Nero, redivivus, legend lasted for centuries. Even as late as the 5th century, whispers lingered. The mad emperor still lives, and one day he will return. The emperors who feared his shadow, the emperors who followed Nero, could not escape his ghost. Galba tried to erase him by stripping his monuments, but he lasted only months. Otho, once Nero's companion, tried to adopt his style, hoping to win the people's love. Vitellius promised bread and games, trying to echo Nero's generosity. Finally, Vespasian, founder of the Flavian dynasty, sought to bury Nero's memory beneath new monuments. He drained the artificial lake of the Golden House and built the Colosseum in its place. Where Nero had built a palace for himself, Vespasian built a palace for the people. And yet, even the Colosseum could not erase the memory of the emperor who had once stood upon its soil, singing as Rome burned. The legacy of fire, the great fire of Rome, remained. Nero's curse, though historians later debated whether he had started it, the memory stuck. To the people, he would forever be the emperor who played music while the city burned. Generations would pass, and still storytellers would say, Rome burned, and Nero sang. That image, whether truth or lie, became eternal. The Domus Aurea, the buried palace after his death. Emperors sought to destroy his golden house. Vespasian built over it. Titus opened its grounds to the public. Trajan buried its halls beneath new baths. Yet the palace refused to vanish. In the Renaissance, artists stumbled into its buried chambers, their torches illuminating golden frescoes. They believed they had entered caves, calling them grottos. From that word came grotesque, a style of art inspired by Nero's forgotten halls. Even in ruin, Nero's dream of art lived on, shaping culture centuries after his fall. Nero in the East. Strangely, outside of Rome, Nero was remembered more kindly. In Greece, he was honored for his performances, his love of music, his sponsorship of games. Some cities even built statues to him, celebrating the emperor who had treated them with respect. In the East, his legend grew. For the Parthians, he was a symbol of Rome's weakness, the mad emperor who divided his empire. In Jewish and Christian writings, he became a dark figure, a symbol of divine punishment. Nero's fame stretched beyond the borders of the empire. Few emperors achieved such reach. The final curse, damnatio memoriorum, tried to erase him. His name was struck from inscriptions. His statues were destroyed, his memory condemned. But the attempt backfired. The more Rome tried to forget him, the more impossible it became. His name lingered in songs, in whispers, in scripture, in rumor. No condemnation could silence the fascination with Nero. Even in disgrace. He achieved what he wanted, immortality. The dual legacy. Nero's curse was not just destruction, but paradox. To some, he was the greatest tyrant of Rome, a symbol of corruption and madness. To others, he was a tragic artist, misunderstood, more performer than ruler. To Christians, he was the beast, the persecutor of faith. To the poor, he was the emperor who fed them, entertained them, and dared to stand upon the stage. He was all of these things, and he was none of them. That is why his story never ended. Nero was gone, but his shadows stretched across centuries. He had sought glory, and instead found infamy. He had sought immortality, and achieved it in the darkest of ways. Rome tried to curse him, but in cursing him, they gave him eternal life. For generations, Nero would be remembered as both monster and artist, tyrant and dreamer, beast and man. That was his curse. That was his victory. Chapter 20. The Eternal Flame of Nero. A Rome without its emperor. The year was 68 CE. Nero lay dead, abandoned in a shallow grave, his empire in chaos. But though his body was gone, his story had only just begun. Rome tried to erase him. The Senate passed a decree of damnatio memoria, condemning his memory. His statues were toppled, his name scratched from inscriptions, his monuments defaced. His palace, the Domus Aurea, was buried beneath new construction. And yet, Nero refused to vanish. Like the fire he was accused of starting, his memory spread, uncontrollably, burning across centuries. The aftermath of madness. Rome was fragile after his death. The year of the 4 emperors tore the empire apart. Galba, Otho, Vitellius, Vespasian. Each claimed the throne, each struggled to hold it, and in their struggle, Nero's ghost loomed over them. Galba tried to undo Nero's extravagance, but the people despised him. Otho imitated Nero's mannerisms, hoping to win their love. Vitellius promised games and feasts, echoing Nero's generosity. Only Vespasian built lasting stability, burying Nero's memory beneath his new dynasty. But even then, Nero's name was never far from the lips of the people. The peoples. Emperor to the elites, Nero was a tyrant, but to the common people, he remained strangely beloved. They remembered the grain he distributed, the games he hosted, the spectacles he performed. They remembered an emperor who dared to step upon the stage and sing like one of them. When he died, the people mourned. Women laid flowers upon his grave. Crowds whispered prayers to him as though to a god. For the poor, Nero had been the people's emperor, and no Senate decree could change that. The fire that never went out, the great fire of Rome, defined Nero's reign, and it defined his legend. Whether he had caused it or not mattered little. The image of him standing upon a tower, playing his lyre as flames consumed the city, became eternal. Historians could debate. Some argued he rushed to help, opening his gardens to refugees, leading firefighting efforts. Others swore he sang while the world burned. But in memory, there was no debate. Nero was the emperor who sang as Rome turned to ash. That image was too powerful to die. It became the curse that followed him for eternity. Nero, the artist, what made Nero different was not his cruelty. Rome had seen cruelty before. It was his obsession with art. He did not want to be remembered as a general or a statesman. He wanted to be remembered as a musician, a poet, an actor. He performed in theaters across Greece, forcing audiences to listen to his endless performances. He entered chariot races, sang in contests, demanded crowns for his talent. To Romans, this was scandal. An emperor on stage, an emperor sweating before a crowd. It was shameful. But to Nero, it was glory. He had once said, "If I am not an artist, I am nothing." And in a way, he was right. For centuries after his death, people would not forget his art, his voice, his performances. Even as they cursed him, they spoke of his stage. The Christian's monster for the Christians. Nero became something darker. They remembered the persecution, the executions, the cruelty of the circus. They remembered brothers and sisters, torn by wild beasts, burned as living torches, mocked before cheering crowds. In their writings, Nero was the first Antichrist, the beast of Revelation, the enemy of God. The number 666, they claimed, was a secret code for his name. Every tyrant after him would be compared to Nero, every persecutor measured against his shadow. To Christians, Nero was not just a man, he was the embodiment of evil. The immortal legend, Nato Hegivivus Bucci. Nato's legend did not end with his death. Rumors spread that he had not died at all. Some said he had fled east, to Parthia, waiting to reclaim his throne. Others said he had disguised himself, walking among men, preparing for revenge. 3 times impostors appeared, claiming to be Nero reborn. Each time, they gathered followers, armies, even the support of foreign kings. Each time, they were defeated, and yet the legend grew stronger. For centuries, Romans whispered, Nero will return. Even in the Middle Ages, his name haunted Europe. To many, he was the eternal tyrant, the ruler who would rise again to bring destruction. The Domus Aurea, the palace beneath the earth, though emperors tried to bury his palace. Nero's dream of beauty refused to die. For centuries, the Domus Aurea lay hidden beneath the earth. Then, during the Renaissance, artists stumbled into its buried chambers. By torchlight they saw golden frescoes, intricate designs, strange figures painted across the walls, believing they had entered caves. They called them From this word came grotesque style of art, born from Nero's forgotten palace. Even in ruin, Nero inspired beauty. His art lived on, shaping the future of culture. The eternal contradiction. Nero's story is a paradox. To some, he was the cruelest tyrant Rome had ever known. To others, he was a misunderstood dreamer, a man of art trapped in the role of emperor. To Christians, he was the beast, the Antichrist. To the poor, he was a generous ruler, a performer who gave them bread and song. Was he mad? Or was he simply ahead of his time? Was he a monster? Or was he a tragic artist destroyed by power? The truth may never be known, but that is why Nero endures. The eternal flame even now. Centuries later, Nero's shadow burns. Historians still write of him. Artists still paint him. Filmmakers still reimagine him. His name appears in novels, plays, operas, songs. Every tyrant is compared to him. Every artist in power is judged against his failure. Rome tried to curse him with damnatio memoria, but it failed. For his memory is eternal. Nero himself once said, "What an artist the world loses in me." He was wrong. The world never lost him. Closing narration. Nero's reign ended in fire, blood, and despair. Yet his story never ended. He became myth, demon, artist, tyrant. He became everything Rome feared and everything Rome desired. The Senate condemned him. The Christians cursed him. The poor mourned him. And through it all, his flame burned on. The emperor, who sang while Rome burned, forever remembered, forever cursed. This is Nero's legacy, an eternal flame that no empire, no time, no history could ever extinguish. The past never truly dies. It lingers, haunting us with its echoes. Nero's shadow still burns across the centuries. A reminder of power, madness, and destruction. If you've been captivated by this journey into the darker corners of history, make sure you subscribe to Dark History, because the shadows hold many more secrets, and this is only the beginning.